As she ran, the 7 scaled the wall with ease, then descended upon a patrol walking past. Zusa sprinted across the street, pressing her body flat against the stone wall. She listened for cries of alarm or sounds of combat, but there were none. The elves had slaughtered a full patrol with hardly a noise. Her respect for them went up tenfold. From her own watch, she knew it'd be about a minute before the next one appeared. The elves would have to move fast to accomplish what they desired in such a small window of opportunity. Zusa leaped, grabbed the top ledge of the wall, and vaulted over. She landed amid the bodies, all 5 of the patrol. They lay crumpled about, their throats slashed with fine precision. She looked to the mansion farther up the hill, yet saw no one. She frowned. It didn't matter their speed. She should have seen movement. Unless... Zusa sprinted along the wall, a lump growing in her throat. Sure enough, as she rounded the side, she found another patrol, dead from sliced throats and stabs through the back and into lungs. Deadly killers, all 7, and they weren't heading for Ingram in his mansion. They were making their way to the dungeon. They wanted Elisa. "You won't have her," she whispered. She thought of raising an alarm, but no patrols were near and the mansion was too far away to break a window with a stone to alert the guard. Besides, shouting and hollering would alert the elves to her own approach and she would arrive far sooner than any guard. Drawing her daggers, she steeled herself to fight such incredible opponents. "It'll be like fighting Herne," she told herself. She'd sparred with him plenty on the trip to Angelport. That was the speed to expect, the level of skill to anticipate. And there were 7 of them. At the entrance to the dungeon, she found 2 guards slumped beside the door, long darts sticking out from underneath their helmets. The huge door was open, and from within she heard the sound of shouting and combat. With the dungeon buried under the earth, the noise was well contained, and unless someone made it out, no one would raise the alarm. Gripping her daggers tighter, she knew it might be far too late by the time someone did. Her rescue nearly ended before it began. As she passed through the entryway, every nerve in her body fired off warning. Reacting on instinct, she plummeted to one knee, ducked, and flung her daggers up in a desperate defense. From above the entrance fell an elf, and his sword connected with the daggers with a loud clang. Zusa rolled, knowing he would try to finish her before she regained her footing. Sure enough, she heard the sound of blades scraping against the stone floor, failed slashes mere inches behind her. Reaching a wall, she spun, putting her back to it. The elf lunged, his thrust aimed for her chest. She batted the thrust aside with both daggers. Before she could react further, he continued in with his charge, despite his sword clanging against the wall beside her. His foot connected with her abdomen, and when she swung, he twirled to one side, his fist striking her across the face. Nose bleeding, her stomach cramping, Zusa lifted her daggers and tried to smile. "Come on," she said. "You can do better." The elf's face was painted in a smoothly blended mix of blacks and grays, making his brown eyes shine in the contrast. He grinned, his white teeth vibrant compared to the black of his lips. "A skilled human," the elf said, still, "nothing compared to us." He looped his sword through an intricate display designed to confuse her, but she did not watch the blade, only the movements of his arms and the positioning of his legs. When he tensed, ready to lunge, she fell backward through the shadows of the wall, reappearing on the other side of the entryway. As his sword hit the wall hard enough to create sparks, she leaped at him. Her knees rammed his back, her daggers puncturing his soft leather armor. "If you insist," she hissed into his ear as she twisted the blades. Zusa let him go, and as the body collapsed, she fought a wave of dizziness. Traveling through shadows would not be something she could rely on, not with how drained it left her afterward. She wiped her wrist beneath her nose, and it came back sticky with blood. "Broken," she thought. "Wonderful." Her abdomen still ached, and deep within the dungeon the sounds of conflict lessened. 1 elf down, 6 more to go. Seeing their skill, and having heard the contempt in the elf's voice, she was convinced the rest would expect no attack from the entrance. Surprise was her best weapon, perhaps her only real chance against them. She ran through the dungeon, and at the very first intersection, she saw dead guards leading every direction. Shit! There were 3 main wings to the dungeon, and Elisa might be down any of them. She was certain the elves had broken up to investigate all 3, which left her with no time to think, only react. She ran straight ahead, hoping they'd placed Elisa in the same cell they'd placed Herne. All around her, the prisoners made a ruckus, most seeming amused by the slaughter of the guards they'd witnessed. "You're dead, gal!" one cried as she passed, and her heart jumped into her throat. For before her were 2 elves hurrying along, each one checking the cells on their side for Elisa. The cry didn't grab their attention, and with all her fury she crashed into the pair, her daggers slashing like the claws of a wild beast. She focused on just one, knowing if she got greedy and failed to kill both at once, it'd leave her outnumbered and therefore dead. Blood spilled across her hands, and she kicked the corpse away so she could fight. The remaining elf was a woman, her hair pulled behind her and tightly braided. Blood ran from her forehead, the lone cut Zusa had managed to score after killing the other. The elf wielded a long, curved blade in one hand, and a dagger in the other, the 2 weaving through the air in perfect tandem. Zusa refused to back down, nor be intimidated by their speed. Compared to Herne, the elf was actually slower, and unlike Herne, her blades did not both have a longer reach. Zusa fell into a rhythm, blocking and parrying for a good 10 seconds. She saw the other woman grow confused, as if baffled Zusa could even stand toe-to-toe with her. Zusa chose that moment to strike, slipping between a dual thrust that she'd parried wide to either side of her. But the elf fell back, and her sword sliced back in, so Zusa did the only attack that would still hit, a snap kick to her face. The blow momentarily stole her balance, and Zusa dropped to one knee and swept out the elf's feet from underneath her. Instead of landing hard, perhaps knocking the wind out of her lungs, the elf woman was already rolling. Zusa's daggers missed flesh, hitting only stone. Swearing, she chased after. The elf pulled out of the roll, landed softly on her feet, and met her charge. 4 blades danced, parrying and blocking in a blur creatable only by the best. But Zusa would be better. She had to be. In her heart, she thought of Elisa and what the elves might do. The fury gave her strength, and when she stole the offensive, she hammered away at the elf's blades as if they were mere playthings in her way. The elf tried to flee, but Zusa would not let her. Sensing her hesitation, she feinted, then took out her knee with a solid blow from her heel. As the elf fell, Zusa cross-cut, tearing open her throat. Elven blood poured across the cold stone. "Elisa!" Zusa called out as she staggered toward the end of the hall. She came upon the same dark cell Herne had been in, and in the thin sliver of light she saw it empty. Her heart sank. She had guessed wrong. Running back toward the entrance, she prayed that somehow she would make it in time. She didn't care if Karak heard or if Asher answered. It didn't matter. Elisa mattered. The cell doors flashed by, the jeers and catcalls only distant groans of insects to her. Back at the initial intersection, she saw them, 4 elves hurrying in tandem. Slung across one of their shoulders, bound and gagged, was Elisa. Their backs were to her, but they must have noticed the other elves' absence and were on alert. One turned to face her, his painted face glaring as he readied his long blade. The other 3 shouted something in Elvish and ran toward the exit. "Did you kill Salias and Treyarch?" he asked in the human tongue as she readied her daggers. "Don't forget whoever was at the door," she said, flashing him a smile that felt born of mania and desperation. His face hardened in the dim torchlight. "I'll make sure your death is painful." He lashed out, an upward swipe that passed an inch away from her face, cutting strands of her hair. This elf was faster, and she felt slower, her battle lust fading. Zusa retreated, but the elf matched her step for step. Her daggers batted left to right, blocking his smoothly connected strikes. His sword was a blur, and she had to fight to keep herself focused. No time for this, she thought, but already defeat clawed at her mind. The elves would escape, and Elisa with them. She'd failed. The elf backed her into a corner, and she felt the heat of a torch burning beside her head. You ended lives that walked this land for hundreds of years, he said. No greater sin poisons this world than that of your kind. His sword danced, and she was a poor partner. Without room, her dodges were limited and his speed incredible. Any time she countered, he'd leap back, slap the weapon aside, and then lunge, relying on his greater reach. With every passing moment, her exhaustion ebbed away at her reflexes. He scored cut after cut, and at least once she saw him purposefully twist the blade to the side so it did not embed into her flesh. The elf was mocking her, covering her body with a dozen gashes. The insult was too much. She weakly slumped back against the wall, tears in her eyes. "Just end it," said Zusa. The elf frowned, obviously disappointed. He closed in, the tip of his blade aiming for her throat. No comment this time, no biting words. The muscles in his body were tense, and death was in his eyes. When he thrust, Zusa parried it to the left, letting out a cry as the tip slashed across her cheek. Her other hand reached out and he moved to dodge, but she wasn't stabbing with it. She was throwing. The dagger hurled true, piercing his side. It wasn't fatal, but the delay was enough. She yanked the torch from the wall and swung. He blocked, but the fire was in his eyes. She swung again and again, always toward his face. At last she let it drop, and she could see his pupils dilating. In that brief moment as the torch fell, when his vision would be all spots and shapes, she closed the distance between them, wrapping her free arm around him as if in an embrace. Her other rammed the blade of her dagger through his ribs and into his heart. She let him drop, then spat on his corpse. "Never talk to me of sin," she said. Zusa looked to the exit, to where the starlight shone on an empty walkway. Guards would be there soon, but they would not catch the elves, nor would they catch her. She ran. Herrn woke to the sound of his door opening. He looked up, the sleepiness in his head vanishing at the sight of Zusa standing there, her wrappings cut and torn, seemingly every inch soaked with blood. "Zusa?" he asked, stumbling out of bed. She took a limping step closer, then collapsed into his arms. "They took her," she said. "Took her? Who, Alisa? Who took her?" Her fingers clawed against his chest and her whole body shook. At first he thought it was weakness, maybe from blood loss, but when she looked into his eyes, he realized it was rage struggling to break free. "The elves took Alisa," she said. "They'll kill her. I know it. They'll kill her, but I'll make them pay. All of them, this whole damn city will pay in blood." He held her close, and she pressed her bruised forehead against his chin. "I don't care if this city burns," she said, her voice suddenly softening. "I just want her back. Please, that's all I want. Without her—" Herrn wrapped his arms tighter about her, and she felt so small then, so close to breaking. "We'll find her," he said. "All's not lost yet. We'll find her, save her. I promise." She pulled away. "Don't make promises you cannot keep," she said, beginning to undress. "Now help me bandage these cuts, and quickly. If we're to act, we have little time to spare. There's only one place the elves would take her." "Where's that?" he asked. She gave him a look as if he were a simpleton. "To their forest," she said. "They'll take her to Quelazar, and once there, not even the greatest army of man could save her from their blades." Chapter 19. Alisa awoke in the middle of the act of vomiting, her stomach heaving while her abdomen tightly cramped. Vertigo came next, the ground seemingly above her. Closing her eyes, she realized she was slung over someone's shoulder. Soft whispers in a language she assumed was Elvish came from either side of her. Daring to open her eyes once more, she saw they were running. With strange glee, she noticed she'd vomited on her elven captor's boots. When she tried to look up, she felt pressure on both her neck and her wrists. They were tied together, she realized, with an intricate knot. Testing, she tried pulling her wrists apart, only to choke off her next breath. Struggling would be useless. Trying to relax, she looked up as much as she could without strangling herself in the vain hope she'd recognize her surroundings. But there were no nearby buildings, no distinguishable landmarks. Instead, she saw hills and grass and the occasional cluster of trees. Her heart sank. The elves had captured her from her prison, knocked her unconscious, and then smuggled her out of Angelport. Whatever safety she might have known in her cell, it was gone. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. The elf tensed, and the sickening motion of his running halted. The ground pitched before her, and then she hit, having been unceremoniously dumped to the grass. She rolled over, forced to sit on her hands since they were tied low and behind her back. 3 camouflaged elves gathered about her, 2 men and 1 woman. Their faces were painted in various shades of blacks and grays, their clothing dark and loose. They'd pulled off their hoods, though, and there was no mistaking the point of their ears. "You have no right to ask questions," said the one who had carried her. He was the tallest of the 3, with long golden hair stretching to his waist. "Why not?" she asked, knowing she had to get them talking if she were to have any hope. "Does the butcher tell the pig where it's going on the way to the slaughter?" asked the female. "I am no pig." "I know others who might disagree." The 3rd elf snapped at them in Elvish, and the 2 fell silent. He was shorter than the female, with emerald eyes that were mesmerizing to behold. Alisa tensed as he knelt before her and grabbed her chin with his fingers, tilting her head so she would look directly into his face. "You are to be granted an audience no human deserves," he said. "We will let you kneel in the presence of our princess and hear her pronounce judgment against you for your crimes. You sent your pet after her, but we are no fools. We know the evil that lurks in mankind's heart. Others may be naive enough to seek peace, but we are not. You will die, Alisa. Your corpse will be burned, so perhaps your ashes will foster life in our forest to atone for your betrayal." He leaned closer, as if he were about to kiss her. "That is, if we do not send your head back to the lords of Angelport, so they know Celestia's children will no longer suffer their foolishness and greed." Alisa swallowed, and every bit of contempt her position had fostered over her lifetime surfaced to protect her with a strong mask. "If your princess would be so foolish as to execute me, then prepare to be the last of Celestia's children. War will follow, and make no mistake, your race will not survive." He gently cupped her cheek in his palm and smiled. "Strong words," he said. "Strong, hollow words. Stand up." Slowly she obeyed, grimacing at the aches in her lower back and legs. Stealing a glance behind her, she saw the fading lights of Angelport at least a mile in the distance. She tried not to let her disappointment show at being so far away. Still, no matter the distance, Zusa and Hern would find out about the break from the prison and come looking for her. The question was, would she still be alive by then? The elf with emerald eyes slashed the rope that bound her ankles tightly together but left the others. "Run away if you wish," he told her. "I would gladly accept a reason to kill you." Instead, Alisa stood as straight as her bonds allowed, refusing to let them defeat her in any way. "Lead on," she said. "I do not fear your princess, nor any fate she decrees." The tall elf laughed, and the female grabbed the severed rope at her feet. She looped it about Alisa's neck, and then held the end. "Come, dog," she said. "Stand proud if you wish. You will still arrive on a leash." They led her farther from Angelport toward a copse of trees that appeared to be growing around a pond. Every noise made Alisa tense. Every shadow she hoped was Zusa peering out from the darkness. The rustle of leaves and grass in the wind was the Watcher's approach. Yet on and on they walked, and no one came. As they neared the copse, Alisa realized the pond was nothing but an illusion, and with each step it faded away, revealing a large tent built behind a roaring bonfire. Several elves stood around it, but one in particular caught her eye. It was Larissa, sitting beside the fire in an elegant dress. In the yellow light, Elisa could see the bruises fading from her face, as well as a bulge in the side of her slender dress, no doubt from her bandages. Her skin had faded, looking pale and sickly. Elisa's heart ached seeing such damage. To see a beautiful woman of noble birth beaten and marred in such a way felt vile and against all proper order of things. She could understand their anger as they led her toward the fire, but that did not change her mood. Her life depended on maintaining her composure and convincing them of her innocence. "Greetings, Lady Larissa Sinistel," she called out as the light of the fire reached her skin. "I heard you'd returned to Quelazar. Consider me both surprised and pleased to be a guest in your presence, as you were once a guest in mine." By the way Larissa's face twitched, she could tell the comment stung. Elisa knew much of mankind's traditions in court and nobility were based on the elves' own culture, and to appear inferior in any way insulted their sensibilities. "Remove her bonds," Larissa ordered. "She poses no threat and must still give her testimony before I pass judgment." Elisa stared at her as the elves cut her free. Absently, she rubbed her throat, which felt raw from contact with the rope. Glancing at herself, she saw her dirty, torn dress, the same she'd worn since being taken from the temple days ago. No doubt she looked the pauper amid the finely dressed elves. Even those who had captured her, in their leather armor, appeared more prepared for a pleasant evening than she did. Larissa asked one of the elves something in her native tongue, and when given the answer, she frowned. Elisa could only guess the reason. "Do you know of a woman with dark skin?" Larissa asked. "Her hair is black, cut short, her body wrapped in strange clothing. One of your servants, perhaps?" Elisa wondered why they asked, but knew she couldn't risk lying. The elven kind were known for their excellent skill at detecting lies, and beyond that, she had no idea what magic might be cast about the camp. Every lie she spoke might let out a great plume of smoke for all she knew. "The woman you describe sounds like a companion of mine named Zusa," she said. "Why do you ask?" Again, Larissa spoke with the three who had brought her. Her frown deepened. "Because she appears to have killed 4 of my warriors. Your crimes against me only grow, Elisa." "No doubt she thought she was protecting me," Elisa said. "Indeed, what else might she have thought when elves come at night, break into a human prison, and drag me across the land for a secret trial? I have sworn no allegiance to you, Larissa. Only to the king's justice do I bow, and only he may administer it. You have no authority here, not in our lands, and not with one of the king's citizens." This caused a stir among the elves, and more puzzling, she saw that it was not just anger at her words. A spark of hope burned in her chest. Could it be there were elves, even in this dark court, who actually agreed? Rarely were humans unified in thought when it came to anything. Surely it made sense elves were the same, even if to a lesser extent. More than anything, she wished she had learned their language. Her old advisor had suggested it many times, but she'd shrugged him off, not seeing the point. Listening to the fluid words all about her, she now saw otherwise. Too late, of course. That tended to be how those things went. "We have tried finding justice in your courts," Larissa said, ending the argument, "just as we have tried for peace. Ingram hanged men he claims killed Sildur, but I know he only guesses, only hopes we accept such a petty token. Angelport is sick with betrayal, rife with anger, and ruled by cowards and greedy men. No, out here, in the wild, we will pass our judgment and have our justice. You may not accept any court other than your king's, but your crimes have gone beyond the human realm and into ours. As for your war—" Larissa stood, leaning heavily on her chair. Despite the shaking of her arm, she let it go and stood to her full height without aid. Looking down at Elisa, she shook her head. "We do not fear the blades and fires of man. We are Celestia's children. My father walked the land when your gods first breathed life into the dust, creating such imperfect servants. We saw you come from dust, and will still be here when you return to it, having learned nothing, accomplished nothing. Only destruction. It is all you humans know." All about her the elves cheered, and whatever hope Elisa had dwindled and died. She was not on trial, not anymore. There in the starlight, she stood representing the crimes of all her race. Her innocence didn't matter. Her words of defense would not change anything. The elves wanted blood for Larissa's wounds and for the others killed by the mobs. Random low-born peasants hanging from ropes would not satisfy them. They wanted the high-born, the nobles. Someone whose death would matter. Someone like Elisa. She prayed her execution would be swift and without pain. "Look at me," Larissa said, stirring Elisa from her thoughts. "I heard the words whispered to me as I lay dying, a bag over my head. I saw the eye drawn in my own blood beside me in the dirt. You sent the Watcher after me, your little pet from Valderan. This is what happens when you turn on your friends," he told me. "What further proof do I need? Was your anger truly so great, all because we would not risk our lives for you?" Elisa stood tall, refusing to be humbled, regardless of her attire or the filth of the dungeon caked to her skin. "When the mob attacked you, I was in hiding at a temple of Asha. I did not send the Watcher after you. Even now you are manipulated by the fools you so openly deride. Do you think you would have lived if I had sent the Watcher? Do you think he'd be so foolish as to leave his mark? You believe the lies you hear because you desire vengeance, and I fit every falsehood you put upon my kind. You want to believe us betrayers, murderers, a race without hope, without redemption. Even those who helped you might turn on you. That's what you want to believe. You need it all so you can justify the bloodshed you wish to create." She turned and spat, knowing full well how great an insult it was to do so in front of their princess. "I will have no part of it and will accept no blame. I never betrayed you. It was you who betrayed me. I never struck against you. It was you who came after me, killing all in your way. I have tried to prevent warfare, yet you have courted it with every word you speak and every arrow you fire. Execute me if you wish, but I die innocent, and the war you so desperately seek will destroy the last hope of peace between our kind. Go on, Larissa. Kill me. Let me see the hatred, ignorance, and bloodlust in your eyes, so I may know elf and man are alike in every single way." The camp went silent. She could sense the mood about her, and it had turned decisively cold. A sarcastic smile tugged at her lips, and she truly could not care. For so long she had helped the elves, trying to find a compromise that would benefit the trifect while minimizing the loss of life. If they wanted to kill her for it, then so be it. Her heart ached for Nathaniel, and she wished to hold him in her arms and say goodbye. But the world was a cruel place. She'd learned that long ago, sitting in her own father's dungeon, shivering in the cold. "On your knees," Larissa said. When Elisa refused, 2 elves approached, grabbed her shoulders, and forced her to obey. One of them tugged her hair so she would lower her head respectfully. "Elisa Gemcroft, I find you guilty of your accused crimes. You have struck against my kind, inspired mobs to riot, and nearly took my own life. You deserve a lengthy execution, but because of your rank, and your past cooperation, I will give you a painless death." The elf with the emerald eyes drew his sword, the blade sliding smoothly out of the oiled scabbard. Pulling back on her hair, he lifted her up so she might face Larissa. The keen edge of his sword pressed against her throat, and all around her the elves held their collective breath. "Do you have any last words for me to pass on?" the elven princess asked. "A final goodbye to your son, perhaps?" Elisa winced at the pain from her pulled hair. "No goodbyes," she said, catching sight of movement just beyond the ring of elves. "Not yet." Zusa leaped from behind one of the trees, and before the other elves could react, her dagger pressed against Larissa's throat. All around, elves drew weaponry and reached for bows, but Larissa cried for them to halt. "That's a smart girl," Zusa whispered into the elf's ear. "Now, let Elisa go before I start cutting." "No," Larissa said. Elisa felt the sword against her throat turn, angling sharper into her flesh. Blood trickled down the blade. "Once she is safely away, you will kill me." "I will kill you if she stays. This is not a negotiation." Elisa could feel the tension, so thick it made breathing feel difficult. Zusa's stealth had been perfect, her plan simple enough, but it seemed Larissa had no intention of playing along. "I am not alone," Zusa cried to the others. She pulled the princess closer, one arm holding her head, the other positioning the dagger. "One false move, Larissa dies, and you will face the Watcher." "You will suffer for this," Larissa said. "I am no hostage to be taken. Release me or Elisa dies." Zusa looked to the elf who held Elisa, addressing only him. "If Elisa dies, I lose my employer. If Larissa dies, you lose your princess. I wonder who will suffer more when we return to our homes." "Do not listen to her," Larissa insisted. "We have given in to their fear for too long." Elisa could sense the uncertainty of her captor. He pulled harder on her hair, but the sword no longer cut into her skin. Zeus's eyes swept the camp. They were badly outnumbered, and while holding Larissa kept them from attacking. So far, it had not bought her and Elisa an escape. The threat of fighting Herne seemed to have carried little weight as well. A far cry made Elisa jump, and pain streaked across her throat, the blade giving her a shallow cut. She wished to turn and look, but could not. Instead, she heard a body drop, and then Herne speak. "He was to release an arrow," said the Watcher. "A bad decision." Herne on one side, Zusa on the other, with Elisa caught in the center. Both sides were eager to fight, but neither was willing to risk the death of their hostage. She tried to think of a solution, but could not. Part of her just wanted them to flee, to live. She saw no way for them to escape alive. But she didn't need to. "Larissa!" She recognized that voice. Storming into the camp came the ambassador, his face livid. He shouted something in Elvish, turning and berating many of them at once. Larissa said something in argument, but Graven didn't even let her finish. He turned to Elisa and bowed. "Forgive us this horrible travesty," he said. "I can assure you these elves do not represent Quelazar in any way." "I find that hard to believe," Zusa said. "If you wish to live, you must. They will not harm you, but first you must let Larissa go." Elisa looked to Zusa, who shrugged. The emerald-eyed elf started to object, but Graven shouted him down in their language. Again he bowed low. "Please, Elisa, you must trust me. There is no other way out of here alive." Elisa swallowed, and praying she was making the right decision, she ordered Zusa to let the princess go. Larissa hurried away and collapsed into the arms of another elf. Blood seeped from the bandages in her side, the red staining her dress. Meanwhile, the elf holding Elisa tensed, but Graven lowered his voice and spoke with undeniable authority. The blade left her throat, and she felt the pressure on her head disappear as he released her hair. She accepted Graven's offered hand. Come with me, all of you, he said, glancing at Zusa and Hern. Don't worry. We won't be followed. The last comment seemed more directed to Larissa, who openly glared at the ambassador. Zusa slid in beside her, grabbing her hand as they rushed along the green countryside. I am glad to see you well, she said. Alisa allowed herself to smile. Me too. Hern moved to the other side of her, constantly turning his head so he might watch the elven camp. Too easy, he said, as if in doubt of their escape. You're right, Graven said, leading them on a path toward the main road running south into Angelport. You are only safe in my presence. The rest will hunt you. Rest assured of that. How is it you may overrule the demands of a princess? Asked Alisa. Because she was ordered to return to Quelizar and leave all dealings with humans to my discretion. If Larissa disobeyed and caused a war, then she might have faced potential banishment if there was enough uproar about it. Would there be? Graven spun, fast enough all three tensed. Make no mistake, said the elf. Doing this puts my reputation at great risk. I requested your release under terrible pressure, and my objections are well known to the rest of our nobility. There are many who believe your death will avert a war, and they question where my loyalties lie. You are safe in my presence. But the moment I am gone, they will take their justice, knowing there is little I can do to punish them. He turned and continued on. Ingram has refused handing you over because he knows the recent riots will be nothing compared to the fury he would face should word reach the commoners. Many of my colleagues in Quelizar have taken a similar hard line, and will march upon Angelport if that's what it takes to bring their desired justice. Whether you deserve it or not, you've become a focal point, a symbol of human aggression against elven kind. More will die until Ingram regains control of his city, and my own people acknowledge the truth staring them in the face. And what truth is that? Asked Hern. The ambassador turned and gave him a look Alisa could not decipher. That we are fading, he said. Our rule over Desrel has long ended. Our numbers dwindle, and every day the power of man tightens around our borders. Already one of your kings chased the Desren elves across the nations and burned their beloved city to the ground. Graven shook his head. One day, those same torches will come for us. I must do all that I can to prevent that. Or, at the least, delay it. I will not see those I love perish in such a way. I will not let the tragedy at Deseria happen again. They reached the road, and Alisa joined Hern in looking behind them. You won't see them, Graven said, but they are following, I assure you. We have little time. There must be something I can do, Alisa said. Some way to prevent all this. There is. Graven looked to Angelport. You disappear. My people will look, of course, and they'll believe Ingram has you in hiding. Still, that gives me more to work with than if my kind knew for certain you were in his custody. Ingram will do a fine job accusing us of lying in return, since we broke into his dungeon. That alone will be a fine mess to explain. But so long as you remain a mystery, I believe I can keep things from worsening. We need to return to Veldaren, Hern said, his hands resting on the hilts of his sabers. Only there will you be safe, Alisa. No, Graven insisted. You will never make it. They'll watch the roads and track you with ease. A dozen arrows would pierce your body long before reaching Veldaren. Come with me to Angelport. I know a place you may hide, and the city walls will delay them long enough for you to disappear. And if we're blessed, we might even discover whoever it was who did attack Larissa. Alisa chewed her lip, and she looked at the other two. Hern shrugged, and Zusa put a hand on her shoulder. Do what you think is right, she said. Thinking of that tense moment in the camp and how the ambassador had diffused it, she nodded. Lead on, she told Graven. and let us pray to whatever gods might listen that we find a way to save us from war." Graven smiled, and he bowed low. "Of course, milady," he said. "Follow me." Chapter 20. At the port and loan, Warwick's son met with the last surviving members of the merchant lords, taking count of casualties and losses. Their meeting table was overloaded with strong alcohol as they toasted and drank. No one cared it was hardly an hour past sunrise. It was not a time for sobriety.
"I am fortunate enough to have my wealth forever on the water," said Warwick, leaning back and resting his hands in his lap. "Madeline's mercenaries burned my home, but that is no sore loss. A shame about my paintings, though. Those commissions were not cheap."
"I'm sure Aaron wished he had gotten away so lightly," Stern said, downing another shot. "You see what they did to his body? Gave him a damn necklace made of his own guts. Fuckers. Glad I gave as good as I got when it comes to killing." "That is because you have a demon's luck," said Durgo Flynn. "I lost 5 ships to their fire, and many good crewmen. But I did not have the Wraith fighting to protect my home." A stir spread through them merely at the mention of the Wraith's name. "Demon's luck?" asked Stern. "I stumbled upon my brother's corpse in a bloody alley, a week after attending the funeral of my only daughter, and you'd accuse me of a demon's luck?" Beside him, Flint Amour shifted uncomfortably. "We ran when we saw the mercenaries coming," he said. "Not much we could do. They killed my brothers as well, all of them." "Yes, I'm sure," Stern said, rolling his eyes. "Mighty convenient, that." Flint flushed and focused on drinking instead of responding.
"There is that strange business, the Wraith's aid,"
Warwick said, scratching at his nose with his wrinkled hands.
"He has struck at us before, yet now he protects us, despite our ineffective bounty on his head. What game does he play?"
"Well, if it is a game, I'd like to join." Stern hurled his cup against a wall just above the head of a servant. "We lost hundreds of thousands of gold coins worth of supplies, homes, plus 2 of our lords, yet Ingram does nothing. Madeline's sitting safe behind her walls, and our lord won't do a damn thing to bring justice."
"Justice in Angelport has always been brought about by our hand,"
Warwick said, doing his best to be patient. Stern was usually more level-headed, but the loss of his daughter and now Ulrich had left him raw and unpredictable.
"And we still have many fighting men at our disposal. If we had known of Madeline's attack in advance, we would have crushed them at our gates. Alas, she was one step ahead, but we cannot let that happen again. We must remove her as a threat. But how?"
"She's got too many mercenaries left for us to assault her mansion," Stern said. "And any attack we make risks bringing the city guard down on our heads. Gods know Ingram would love the excuse."
"Our riots have left him frightened," Warwick said. "They served their purpose. One false step, and we will have him supplanted as ruler, the city delivered to us by the hands of its own people. He will not interfere."
Durgo stood, striking the table with an enormous fist. His surprising outburst, contrary to his soft-spoken nature, left Warwick more annoyed than anything. "We must act like cowards no longer," Durgo said, glaring at all of them. "Damn Ingram, damn Madeline, damn the whole city. It is time we stopped fearing their reactions, their plans, and do as we please. Madeline needs to die, regardless of what Ingram thinks. I say we gather who we have, then attack. We'll hang her body at the docks and let every lord and noble see what happens when they oppose us." Slow, mocking applause met his speech, and they all turned to see a hooded figure enter the dark room, a grand smile on his face.
"Well spoken," said the Wraith. "Brave, but stupid, just as I've come to expect from you merchant lords."
Stern bolted to his feet, his hand falling to the hilt of his sword. Durgo armed himself as well, though Flint stood perfectly still. Warwick felt only tired amusement at the attempted grand entrance.
"You,"
said Flint, sounding terrified.
"how did you get past the guards?"
The Wraith hopped atop the round table, crouching down as he grinned at Flint.
"I killed them, of course."
"We want no trouble here," Stern said, tensing. The Wraith shifted his way.
"Strange, given that amusing bounty you placed on my head. Are you still upset about my killing William? His replacement, while young, seems far more competent. I thought you'd be happy for the improvement."
Warwick knew he'd be furious at such a statement made against his own father, but Flint just sat there looking sick. So much for the bravado, he thought. At least William wouldn't have pissed his pants staring face to face with a murderer. The others had been happy to see William go, but they had never truly seen William's strength, his ability to make deals without his pride getting in the way.
"Why are you here?"
Warwick asked.
"I'm too old for games and not foolish enough to believe we stand a chance should you wish us dead. Now speak, or draw your blade."
Wraith bowed, and Warwick held in his smile. The man wasn't there to kill, after all. If it came to deals, then who in Angelport was better at making them than him?
"Luckily for you, I am not much for wasting time either. Your plans for revenge are amusing, I must admit, but they are irrelevant. Madeline Keenan is not your worry. Lord Ingram is."
"He's got armored men," Stern said. "Well trained, with many of them killers and thugs long before adopting his standard. Even with our forces combined, we cannot yet challenge him, especially without a valid reason to do so. King Edwin will be furious at us deposing one of his appointed lords." The Wraith's grin grew.
"You simple men with your simple ideas. I do not want you to overthrow Ingram. I want you to save him."
Stern's brow furrowed, and Warwick tilted his head to one side and tapped his lips.
"How so?"
he asked. The Wraith hopped down from the table and walked over to one wall, which was decorated with a painting of the docks, the waters full of majestic boats and tanned men hard at work.
"Tonight, a large group of elves will launch an attack against the city," he said as he looked the painting over. "Don't worry about your walls. They're already inside. They'll kill everyone in Ingram's mansion, in his dungeons, and they'll come hunting for you as well. This is their last desperate attempt, a hope to win a war before it even starts."
Warwick leaned back in his chair, his hands pressed against his chin as the gears in his head began turning.
"Why come to us?"
Stern asked, glancing at the others as if to gauge their opinions.
"And why would we help Ingram?"
"My affairs are my own," the Wraith said, "and I come to you because the elves must not win. Prepare your forces. Prepare for battle. Let them find an ambush waiting for them, instead of fat merchants and helpless servants. Otherwise—" He pulled something from his pocket, rubbed his fingers together, and then touched the painting. Fire spread across the canvas, consuming the docks and turning the boats to ash. The Wraith turned back to them, his grin looking demonic in the red light. "Fight them, kill them, or watch every last remnant of your wealth burn."
"Thank you for this warning," Warwick said, slowly standing. "You have given us much to think about and discuss."
The Wraith bowed low.
"I aim to help," he said.
Shooting one last grin at Flint, he headed for the door. Just before leaving, he turned back.
"Oh, and should you cooperate, I have a fine gift for you, one I'm sure you'll appreciate. I'll give you an hour to discuss, then return for your answer."
With that, he exited the room, having never once drawn his sword. Immediately the tension lessened, and Stern plopped back into his seat. The others looked about as if unsure what to say.
"Well?"
Stern asked, throwing up his hands. "Do we trust him?"
"He's killed too many,"
Durgo said, shaking his head.
"Lies are not beyond him."
"No," Warwick said. "I think he's telling the truth." Stern nodded, and despite his apparent frustration, he seemed to agree.
"The elves know of our insistence on receiving portions of their lands. When they're done with Ingram, they'll come for us. Should we prepare and do what the wraith says?"
Warwick's wrinkled face stretched into a smile. All around him, he saw the others take notice of the sparkle in his eyes, the sheer amusement at manipulating one who thought himself above all manipulation.
"As he says?"
Warwick shook his head.
"Oh, no. Not quite."
Darrell sat in the back of the tavern, his beard soaked with spilled ale. He was in no mood for cheer or talk, and his glare made that clear to several women who drifted over. Any other day, he might have taken 1 or 3 back to his ship. "Damn it," he muttered, spilling his mug when he reached for it. As the liquid splashed across the floor, he realized a man had joined him at the table.
"What in Karak's name do you want?"
Darrell asked.
"A sober man to talk to," said Stern, frowning at him. "Though it appears I hope for too much. Fuck off."
He waved for one of the wenches to bring him more, but Stern's look sent them back to the bar, leaving Darrell dry and unhappy.
"We have matters to discuss," Stern said, "and I'd prefer you keep your attention on me, not your mug."
"Far as I know, you don't give me orders," Darrell said. "That was your brother. How's the fellow doing, anyway?"
"Oh, that's right. He's dead."
"Bastard. Did he leave the ship in my name? Course not. I got no gold and no crew, all because he wanted us here to fight instead of doing our damn jobs and sailing out with cargo."
"Much of Ulrich's belongings are now mine," Stern said, leaning back in his chair. "That means I can give you back the Raven Shade if I felt it a wise decision."
Through Darrell's alcohol-clouded mind, a realization forced its way through. He straightened up and decided that just maybe he should be a bit nicer to Stern.
"Been on boats since I was 9,
he said, trying to wipe ale from his beard, a hopeless task.
"I know my crew, my boat, and every trick the seas can throw at me. You won't find yourself a better captain."
Stern's smile was full of condescension, but Darrell tried not to show he noticed.
"Have no worries. The Raven Shade is yours," Stern said. "But first, there's something you must do for me. My brother trusted you, and you never betrayed him. I'm hoping I might be able to trust you as well."
"These lips stay sealed," Darrell said. "I don't even mutter secrets to my whores. I'll forgive plenty, but oath-breakers deserve to be strung up by their toes and beaten with rods. You want something done? I'll get it done." Stern scratched at his neck and looked him over.
"Perhaps,"
he said, motioning over a serving wench. Darrell grinned as 2 large mugs were set before them, both frothing at the top.
"So, what is it you need?" he asked as he took one into his hands. "Special cargo? Message delivered? A body to vanish?"
Stern smiled.
"I have someone I need you to kill."
Ingram paced the halls of his mansion, muttering to himself. "Where is that damn elf?" he wondered aloud. "He may not come at all," said Yor, lounging in a chair with a bowl of cherries on the table beside him. After each one, he'd spit a pit out and place it atop the fine polished oak. "He should. He's their ambassador, and his elves broke into my prison and slaughtered my guards. Graven should be right here, on his knees, ready to kiss my arse from sunrise to sunset." Edgar leaned against the wall opposite Yor, his arms crossed over his chest. "If he doesn't, perhaps it means the elves have chosen war." Ingram looked once more to the door, his patience wearing all the more thin. "They wouldn't," he said. "Not yet." Edgar shrugged but said no more. Yor continued eating, and Ingram finally gave in and poured himself a stiff drink. Halfway through downing it, he saw the door creep open and a servant stepped inside. "Ambassador Graven of the Elves desires an audience." "About time. Bring him in." Moments later the door flung open and in stepped the ambassador. He looked surprisingly harried, at least for an elf. His robes were wrinkled and strands of his hair hung out of place over his face. He bowed low, his easy smile seeming to belie his appearance. "Greetings, my lords," he said. "I wish I could come to you under better circumstances." "I imagine so," Ingram said as Yor stood and pushed away his bowl. "I have no time for bullshit, so, please, what reason can you offer for elves climbing my gates, killing my soldiers, and kidnapping my prisoners?" Graven sighed, and he crossed his hands behind his back. "A small faction of elves are not happy with the way our delegations have gone, and I cannot blame them. They took it upon themselves to bring Elisa to trial." "You admit it?" Yor said, sounding stunned. "I admit nothing. I only speak the truth. Their actions do not represent all elves, nor the prevailing opinions of Quelazar. I assure you I am as appalled as you are." "I'm sure," Edgar said, running a hand through his curly hair. "Do you know who these elves are? Will you give them to us for punishment?" Graven shifted uncomfortably. "They have been sent back to the Quellan forests and will be dealt with accordingly." Edgar laughed, and Ingram shared in his contempt. "Of course," Ingram said. "You'll send murderers of my guards to Quelazar for your own justice, all while demanding Elisa be handed over instead of undergoing a trial here. We humans tend to be imperfect, but at least we haven't mastered hypocrisy as well as elvenkind." Graven shifted closer, his frustration obvious on his face. "I understand. I really do, but I am doing the best I can under the circumstances. Given the mob's brutal killing of Larissa's escort, anti-human sentiment is rather high." "You've killed plenty more with your arrows," Yor said. "Every day we get families traveling here in hopes of finding a better life, with work that doesn't involve your patrols butchering every farmer and woodcutter that sets foot in your forest. Killings that would stop if you would only reach an agreement with us and stop pressuring for large allocations of land." Ingram put his back to the elf to calm down, and he refilled his glass. "Then, what about Elisa?" he asked. "Will you be returning her to my protection?" "I would if I could." Ingram turned, not at all surprised. "Why can't you?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "I cannot say, other than that she is safely within Angelport's walls. I am doing this for her own protection." "Like as shit you are," Yor interrupted. "You're using her somehow, aren't ya?" The door cracked open, the sound slicing through the tension. My lord," said the servant, looking nervous, Please, if you would bring your attention to the docks, I feel it best you take a look." Ingram raised an eyebrow, but the other two lords only shrugged. He walked over to the curtains across one of the windows and pulled them open with a heavy string. Sunlight flooded in, and from their high perch they overlooked the docks below. Ingram's mouth dropped open at what he saw. "What in blazes is going on?" he wondered aloud. Nearly every last boat in Angelport, regardless of its size, had left port. The sea was full of them, but instead of sailing northeast to the Lost Coast or west for Kerr, They remained close, as if keeping some sort of strange vigil. The few boats remaining at port had been set aflame, and the smoke blotted the sky. The rest joined him at the window, Graven included. He peered out, wearing a deep frown. "Whose boats were burned?" he asked. "It's too far to know," Edgar said. "What game is this, Ingram?" "I don't know," Ingram said. He shot a glare at the elf. "What about you? Care to illuminate us with your fabled elven wisdom?" Graven shook his head. This is unexpected, to say the least. I can think of only two things. Either they expect an attack or plan on making one themselves." Ingram ground his teeth, the sight of all those boats in the distance filling him with fury. "Get out," he told the ambassador. "Go back to your elves. Let them know I will declare war in the name of King Edwin Vaylor against the Quellan Kingdom should even a single elf make another aggressive act against my city. I don't care what reason you give me, or how many apologies you make. You've tried our patience, and were you any other kingdom of man, we'd have already sent troops marching to your borders. This is your last chance for peace. Do not waste it. As for the merchant lords," he nodded toward the ships, "we obviously have much to discuss. Consider their claims against your lands dismissed. I want no concessions, no repayments. Just stop the killings. We still need to work something out over our loggers, but that can come another time. I don't want war. I mean that, I really do. So, for once, listen to me, and do what I ask." Graven looked stunned for a moment, then smiled and bowed. "Thank you," he said. "I'll do my best." When he was gone, Ingram slammed a fist against the window and refused to look at the docks. "What do we do now?" he asked. "I'm still not quite happy with what I just heard," Edgar said, frowning. "Do you know how many of my villagers those elves have killed? Yet we're going to make peace without even an apology?" "Enough! We worry about my city first. Warwick and his merchants look like they're about to launch a damn revolt. I couldn't care less about a few backwater villages. Now again? What do we do?" "We flee." Ingram and Edgar gave Yor looks of complete shock. "Could you repeat that?" Edgar said. "I said we flee." Yor gestured to the grand window. "They have their men gathered, their boats ready. If Angel Port is a fruit, they're the worm that's eaten its way to the core. We must get out of their reach. They have no real armies, no proper training. If given a month to prepare, I could summon several thousand armed men ready to fight, and I know you can do the same, Edgar. It doesn't matter what the merchants do. When we return, we'll crush them to pieces, take their boats, and end their threat once and for all." "Are you mad?" asked Ingram. "You want me to run like a coward?" "A rebellion of peasants and merchants is no light thing," Yor insisted. "Send word to Valdarin and to all the lords in the north. An uprising of commoners against our rule is a threat to us all and must be stamped out with due urgency." Edgar took a step closer, his whole body tense. "You want us to flee," he said, "abandoning the crown jewel of the sea, and with our tails tucked between our legs, go begging for aid from the king." Yor shrugged. "If you want to put it so indelicately, yes." Another step. "And how much did the merchants pay you to say that?" Yor raised an eyebrow, and his confusion only worsened when Edgar drew his sword. Before another word could pass his lips, the sword thrust through his throat. His body convulsed, and blood splashed across them both, dripping down to stain the floor. A twist, and Edgar pulled the blade free, wiping the edge clean with a cloth from his pocket. Ingram watched it all with his mouth hanging open. "Have you lost your damn mind?" he asked, shocked. "That man was practically begging for us to commit treason," Edgar said, sheathing his sword. "King Edwin has given you the Emir to rule, and Angel Port as its seat. To abandon now and let those merchants take over? I don't care if they rule for a day or a month or a year while we prepare. That humiliation will end us, all of us, and it cannot happen. We stay,
And we fight. The words Yor spoke, they were what the merchant lords paid him to speak. I'd risk my life on it."
Ingram glanced at the corpse, then nodded.
"You're right. How many men do you have with you?"
"About 100 trained soldiers."
"Bring them here."
Ingram hurried toward the door, and he began calling out for the captain of his guard.
"When they land their boats, we'll be ready. I want every person at our disposal here, at the mansion. I don't care how many ruffians they've given a sword. They'll break against our walls."
"And the rest of the city?"
Ingram shrugged. "It can burn, for all I care. When they've tried and failed to take over, we'll come storming out. We'll seize their boats and hang every last merchant lord from their ankles. While we're at it, we might even have a few rough words with Madeline, given her own failure in dealing with them. These families, these merchants and lords of coin and trade, they've all pretended a power for too long. With your help, we'll take it all back."
"Of course," said Lord Edgar, bowing low. "I'll begin immediately." Chapter 21. Herne sat restless in the single-room home Graven had brought them to, nestled into a quiet section of Angelport against one of the inner walls. Inside it were plain, barren walls and a dirt floor that always seemed to be wet no matter the time of day. "I did not think you would provide us a place to stay," the elf had told Elisa as they sneaked inside during the cover of night. "I had a human on friendly terms with us procure it for our use. When you agreed to house us, I felt it best to keep this place in case something went wrong."
"Something did,"
had been Elisa's only response. The windows were covered with curtains, leaving the interior dark despite the midday sun. They'd had little to eat, just a small loaf of bread Herne had purchased at the market. None of them seemed to have any real appetite. "It's painful to sit and wait," Zusa said from her position sprawled out across the only bed. Elisa sat at the foot of it, looking very tired. She wore a fine dress of elven make, a shimmering silver to replace her dirty, worn clothing from the dungeon. "What else is there to do?" she asked. "Ingram would imprison me. The merchants would kill me, and the elves would send me off for trial and execution. We'll wait and see what Graven can figure out." "I don't like relying on others for your survival," Herne said, peering out the window to the dull street. The curtain felt scratchy between his fingers, as irritating as his own mood. "We should get you out of Angelport tonight." "Graven said they'd track us." Herne shrugged. "I'm scared of no elf, and I doubt Zusa is either. We're about the best bodyguards you can have. With just the three of us, we should make it back unnoticed." Elisa lay down on the bed, Zusa sliding over to make room. With her hand across her eyes, Elisa sighed. "I know, you're right. I need to be back in Veldarin, where I can deal with Madeline appropriately. I miss my little boy, too. Let's at least wait for Graven. I will not disappear to leave him worried, nor repay all his kindness with such insult." Herne shrugged. "If you insist." He stood and reached for the door. "Where are you going?" Zusa asked. "Out." He kept his sabers hidden within his cloak, his head low and his hood removed so he appeared like every other poor, tired worker of the city. At first, Herne didn't know where he wandered. He just let his instincts guide him. At one point, he'd promised the Wraith he'd investigate this city to learn its secrets, but there was nothing particularly striking or secretive about it. Everyone wanted power. Everyone wanted everyone else crushed underneath their heel. Even Elisa wasn't completely innocent, though her intentions seemed more noble than the norm in this wretched city. To his surprise, when he stirred from his thoughts, he found himself staring up at the meager temple to Ashur. His anger came and went, and despite himself, he entered. Logan was at the door, and he started to greet him until he saw Herne's face. His skin paled, and he dropped the cloth he'd been using to clean the floor. Herne held a finger to his lips. "Not a word," he said. "Go to Noel's room, lock the door, and do not leave for an hour." "Understood." The young man swallowed, and he nodded rapidly. "Good. Logan scurried toward the back of the temple, with Hairn following. Beyond the benches, at the altar, Noel knelt, his head bowed in prayer. Normally interrupting such a private act would have bothered him, but Hairn had no patience for the man's piety, not this time. As Logan went rushing past, Hairn hopped onto the bench beside Noel and leaned his weight on his heels. At the noise, the priest opened his eyes and looked up. His reaction was hardly any better than Logan's. "You," he said, startling bad enough he fell to his rear. "Please, no, don't kill me." Hairn felt as if ice flowed in his blood, but at the same time, he felt so tired, so drained, that he could not muster the anger he thought the man deserved. "Tell me," he asked instead, "do you sleep well at night?" Noel was breathing heavily through his nose, and he glanced around as if unsure whether the question was a trick. "No," he admitted. "Not since, you know. You betrayed us." Noel swallowed. "Yes." Hairn stared at him as if trying to see through the robes, the fear, and his own anger to the man underneath it all. "Why?" he asked. "We trusted you." "Logan told me of the bounty," Noel said, sighing. "I thought if I sold those acres, I could rebuild this temple into something magnificent, something people would feel proud to enter. And there you were, supposed criminals. All I had to do was turn you in." "You'd rebuild your temple with blood money?" "Don't you understand? Look around. This place is empty, broken. Every day I pray to Asher, yet all I feel is isolation. The weight of a whole city lies upon me, and for once, just once, it seemed like I saw a way through. I did it for the souls of thousands, Hairn. What does one little whispered word to a god matter when compared to eternity for so many?" Hairn's fists clenched. "You'd break your trust and profane Asher's ideals, all to serve him? Are you any better? I've learned of you, heard the stories spoken since you came down to join us in Angelport. You keep the thieves in line in Veldaren. You kill to prevent killing. Whose blood is on my hands? Whose lives did I end? Yet I see it in your eyes. You are ready to draw that blade and cut my throat." Hairn did feel that urge, but instead he shook his head. "This city deserves better than you." Noel chuckled. "In that, we are in agreement." As Hairn headed for the door, he stopped and turned back to the priest. "Did Ingram give you your acres of land?" Noel shook his head as he slowly rose to his feet. "No, he did not. What of you? Have you brought Veldaren any peace? Or does death and killing still plague its nights?" Hairn wished he had a better answer, but instead thought of the dead child he'd given to the gravekeeper. No. Innocents still die. Noel gestured about him to the empty hall of worship. "We're not men meant to sleep well through the night," he said. "For whatever it is worth, I wish I could take it back and that you'd forgive my moment of pride. Even if I could haul in the rarest marble and hang the finest silks from the ceiling, it'd still be just me, preaching to a small few in my weakness. I'm the failure here, and not the finest of constructions will hide that." "Then why continue, if you have failed so poorly?" "Because maybe I'll at least save one life," Noel said. "That makes this all matter, right? Besides, there's no one else who will." Hairn put his hand on the door, and the weight of the temple's silence was heavy on his shoulders. "At least in that, I understand," he said, and then he left, feeling no better than when he'd arrived. Turning toward the south, he froze, for billowing smoke met his eyes. He felt his throat turn dry, and he clenched his fists as he stared at the boats pulling out from the docks, all but those that burned. What madness is this? He wondered before sprinting through the street. Under normal circumstances, men and women should have been rushing toward the water to aid in putting out the fires, but circumstances were far from normal. Between the riots, the hangings, and the attacks on the merchant lords' mansions, it had left the people in fear, kept them in their homes, while Hearn rushed as fast as his legs could carry him. The wood planks of the docks thudded beneath his feet as he neared the last boat still yet to catch fire. Several men stood beside it, hurling torches and splashing oil from thick buckets. Hearn drew his swords as he saw the symbol carved into the side of the bulkhead, recognized it as belonging to the Keenan family. So the merchant lords are finally retaliating, he thought as he descended upon the men. Only one cried out in alarm, the rest too busy with the burning. Hearn stabbed him through the gut, twisted the blade, and then yanked it free. As the body fell, he leaped upon the remaining three, cutting and slashing before they could realize they were even under attack. Two fell quickly, but the third he left untouched. The man, bare-chested and deeply tanned, pulled out a heavy knife and did his best to slash at Hearn. Clumsy thrusts. Hearn barely even noticed them. Instead, he pitched one way, then another, using the confusion to slash across the man's wrist, disarming him. Two kicks to the face left him dazed, and a slash to the ankle took him down. Hearn fell atop him, sabers pressed against his throat. "Where are they going?" he asked, his face inches from the other man's. "Not telling you shit," the man said. Hearn pressed harder, drawing a drop of blood. "You die like the others if you don't. What are your friends planning? Do they hope to return later, like some conquering army?" The man laughed, despite his obvious pain. "Army? You got it all wrong, you freak. We're not the ones coming to fight tonight. We're just getting out of the way." Hearn stood, removing his weight from the man, though he kept the tips of his blades pressed against the man's neck. He felt dread building in the pit of his stomach, but he asked the question anyway. "If not your masters," he asked. "Then who? Whose army comes in the night?" The man spat blood to the plank beside him, glared upward, and then gave him his answer. When Graven returned, Elisa's heart immediately dropped at the sight of him. The elf looked flustered and in a great hurry. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting up on the bed so her back rested against the wall. "It is nothing," Graven said, but it was an obvious lie. "Then what nothing bothers you?" asked Zusa, who had begun doing various training stretches to keep herself from going stir-crazy in the small room. Meanwhile, the elf was rifling through one of the few shelves, removing a few personal objects Elisa didn't recognize. "The merchants have done something interesting, and I must try to deal with it accordingly. They launched all their boats from the harbor, burning what few belonged to the Keenans." "What does it mean?" Elisa asked. "I don't know, and I need to find out. Please stay here tonight. I have a feeling it will not be safe for anyone." He glanced around. "Where's the watcher?" Zusa shrugged. "Out." Graven went to Elisa and he grabbed her hands. His were soft and she could feel the sweat on them. "Please," he insisted, "promise me you will stay. Your safety is now my responsibility, and I do not want to bear the shame of something happening to you, especially with all I have gone through." Elisa tried to decide how to respond, especially given her precarious situation. "I will," she said, "only because you have been so kind. Good luck, Graven." The elf smiled. "I won't need your luck, Elisa." He bowed and then left. Zusa came up behind her and wrapped her arms around her as they stared out the window. "It isn't safe," the faceless woman whispered. "Here or leaving?" "Both." Elisa sighed. "I know, but what else can I do? No wonder Laurie had such trouble keeping things in line here in Angelport. I have done no better. I never should have made my coming here a secret. I should have marched down with 1,000 men and killed anyone who moved against us. It seems everyone here has their guards, their mercenaries, and their fighting men. What do I have?" Behind her, Zusa laughed. "You have me and the Watcher. Are we so terrible?" Elisa put her hand on Zusa's. "No, but I'd rather lose 1,000 fighting men instead of you." The door opened and Hairn stepped inside, his face locked in a scowl. There was blood on his boots. "Something wrong?" Alisa asked, stepping away from Zusa. "The docks," he said. "Every boat's fled except a few belonging to Madeline Keenan that were burned." "We know," Zusa said. "Graven told us." "Did he tell you why?" Alisa shook her head. "I can only assume they're planning—" "They're planning nothing," Hairn interrupted. He drew a saber, showing them the blood on it. "I ambushed some men left behind to start the fires. The merchant lords have no attack planned. Instead, they're making sure they're safe on the water when the bloodshed starts tonight." Alisa knew what that meant, but she had to ask, had to hear it out loud. "Safe from who?" Hairn's scowl deepened. "The elves. Tonight, they'll make their move." The room they hid in suddenly seemed so small, the area of the city far less safe than it once was. Alisa wrapped her arms about her and she thought of the chaos that would follow. "Surely they lied to you," she said. "If the elves kill Ingram, it'll be war the moment King Edwin hears of his death." "He wasn't lying," Hairn said, "and it might be war already." "Something this brazen? What can we do?" Zusa gestured to her daggers, lying sheathed upon the floor. "We can stop them." Hairn looked to her, then nodded. "I don't know what hope we have," Alisa told them. "And I don't know what you think of me or my reasons for coming here. But believe me when I say we must save the hundreds of thousands who might die because of their actions this night. Do what you can, the two of you. Save us from ourselves." They readied their weapons, donned their cloaks, hid their faces, and then vanished into the streets of Angelport, where the sun was beginning to set. Chapter 22. Gregory stood at the wall surrounding the mansion, his hand on his sword hilt. It remained in the scabbard, but he liked the assurance of knowing it was there, felt comforted by its cold metal touch. At some point that night, he'd get to use it. "Think those merchant bastards will be foolish enough to attack?" asked the man next to him, a large but gruff guard named Turk. Refusing the standard-issue sword, he kept a large axe on his back, which he claimed was a family heirloom. "I hope not," Gregory said. "Don't make much sense otherwise, though. They sailed off and burned those ships. They got to know we won't go easy on them when they land, no matter what they say." Turk scratched at his beard. "Maybe. But we're ready. Why would they attack when we're ready?" Gregory shrugged. Everyone had been assigned a squad mate to fight with and protect each other's back. Turk was Gregory's. He'd been happy about the situation given how solid a fighter Turk was, but he wasn't much for thinking or stimulating conversation. "Maybe because they think they'll win no matter what?" Turk laughed. "Well, they're stupid then. Look how many we got." "Indeed," thought Gregory. He glanced about the exterior of the mansion. The outer city walls were left with just a skeleton crew, and nearly every guard who had ever lifted a sword had been called in to protect Ingram and his home. 1,000 men in various amounts of armor crowded the grounds, with at least 100 patrolling the outer walls. The fine grass had been trampled into mud, the gardens crushed beneath mailed feet. Many windows were boarded up or otherwise occupied by archers. Around the corner, at the gate where the fighting would be most vital, waited Lord Edgar's men, armed and trained, numbering over 100. From Gregory's position, the wall blocked their sight of the harbor. Still, they'd hastily constructed ladders over the course of the day, and one of them had been given to the pair. Climbing up the 3 steps, Gregory peered over the wall to the distant harbor. "Still not moving," he said. The boats were large shadows on the moonlit water. As he watched, he heard cries of alarm west, and he glanced in that direction. Far off, near the main entrance to the city, a building had somehow caught fire. "What's going on?" Turk asked from below. "There's a fire!" "Well, that's bad. We going to put it out?" Gregory shrugged, but he doubted it. Within a minute, orders came hollering out from the mansion, and various captains repeated them. No one was to leave. It'd be up to the peasants to put it out themselves. Gregory was hardly surprised. From what little he knew of Ingram, the man would be content to let the city burn so long as he survived. Of course, there was the question of who had started the fire. Smoke blotted out the stars as another fire began, this one closer to the center of the city. "Shit!" Gregory muttered. "What now?" asked Turk. Gregory stepped down so the man could look for himself. Seeing the fire, Turk swore long and loud. "You live near there?" Gregory asked. "No. Worried that's the Nag's Head they burned down. Spiteful little fuckers. That's my favourite pub. The folks rioting again?" As smoke drifted higher, this time from a third location, Gregory began to wonder, as did many of the men circling the mansion. "The boat's still out there?" he asked. Turk looked that way, then nodded. "Sure are." "Then what in blazes is going—" He stopped as cries of alarm sounded from the opposite end of the compound. His hand instinctively reached for his sword, and he tensed, looking for enemies. "What's going on?" asked Turk, twisting on the ladder. "Quiet," Gregory said, trying to figure it out. More shouts, plus a shriek of pain. They were under attack. "How'd they get back?" Turk wondered. "The boats are still out there." He suddenly jerked backward, losing his footing on the steps. Down he fell, landing hard on his back. Gregory was at his side in a heartbeat, wincing at the thick arrow shaft embedded in the guard's chest. "Bloody cunts," Turk said, glaring down at the arrow. "They shot me." Outside the wall, chaos erupted. The men on patrol screamed in pain, and the sound of steel on steel rang loud. The men gathered at the gates drew their blades, and cries of warning came from all directions. "We need to get you inside," Gregory said, reaching to remove Turk's armor so he could better see the wound. "To the abyss with that," Turk said, slapping his hand away. "I ain't dying to no elf." Elf? Gregory stepped back, and when Turk snapped the arrow shaft in half, he realized its peculiar make and how much longer it was than their own. Almost in denial, he hurried up the rungs and peered over the wall. Over 30 bodies lay scattered across the ground, nearly all of them city guard. 20 more guards remained standing, but they were surrounded and with their backs to the wall. Fighting them was a squad of 15 elves, their faces and hands painted in camouflage, their long, curved blades slashing through armor as if it were cloth. One in the back noticed him watching, and he pulled a bow off his back. Gregory ducked, and as the arrow flew over his head, he could hardly believe the sheer speed of it. Suddenly their walls and numbers seemed so insignificant. "Can you stand?" he asked, offering his hand to Turk. The man took it, and he grunted loudly as he got to his feet. "Hurts," was all he said when Gregory inquired. Shouted orders came in, demanding they form up. Gregory understood the necessity. Weight of numbers was their only advantage against such an enemy. From that brief glimpse, he knew they would not win skill versus skill. Turk was unable to run, so they hurried toward the front gate as all around them the city guard did the same. Halfway there, he heard the clatter of metal. Glancing back, he saw a rope hurled over the wall, a heavy grappling hook attached to the end. In seconds, elves were vaulting over the fortification with ease. "Move!" Gregory shouted, pushing Turk along. They joined a formation of about 50, all men who had fled the walls. Gregory drew his sword, and Turk readied his axe. A captain cried out for them to hold, to stand firm, and Gregory did his best as 10 elves raced toward them. They were in no lines, no formations, just a brazen, lightning-fast attack in hopes of catching them unprepared. Bracing himself, Gregory swore not to run, not to panic. High above, bolts rained down upon the battleground from crossbowmen at the windows. As if the elves could read their thoughts, they weaved side to side, avoiding nearly every one. "Stand tall!" shouted their captain. "Fight like men, you bastards, and cut them all down!" The numbers were in their favor, and against any other opponent the fight would have ended in moments. The elves, though, twisted and pushed through their formation in a blur of steel and blood. As one neared, Gregory held back and let Turk slash with his axe. The elf ducked below, and as he twisted to stab Turk in the side, Gregory lunged. His blade hit flesh, and he let out a whoop. The elf turned on instinct, tearing open the hole in his side further. Roaring, Turk swung his axe, and the injured elf could not dodge in time. The heavy blade tore through his shoulder, splitting him like a log. "Back!" Gregory cried. Turk heard and obeyed, flinging himself toward the side of the mansion. An elf's blade missed, and the attacker pivoted to charge again. Turk got his axe in the way to block the first hit, but the second slipped beneath and into his side. Praying it wouldn't be fatal, Gregory flanked the elf, thrusting for his spine. Instead, the elf weaved back and forth, blocking and parrying both axe and sword with stunning speed. Gregory tried to match it, but he found himself unable to position his blade correctly. What was supposed to be a killing thrust turned into a weak chop, and the elf suddenly lunged at him, smacking the attack away with ease. Defenseless, Gregory tensed, his left arm pulling up as meager protection. The elf jerked sideways, then fell, a crossbow bolt lodged in his neck. From one of the windows above, he heard a crossbowman cheer. Turk drove his axe into the dying elf's chest, just to be sure. The elves pulled back, their sudden retreat leaving the remaining 30 guards off balance and unsure. Of the initial 10 elves, 6 remained. In similar smooth motions, they pulled the bows off their backs, drew arrows, and fired. Gregory turned sideways to minimize himself as a target, but they were not aiming his way. They were aiming at the windows. 2 volleys later, the guards finally had the sense to rush forward before the elves could turn that deadly accuracy on them. Gregory tried to be on the front line, but Turk took a few steps before staggering. Refusing to leave him behind, he stopped, one eye on the fight, the other on his squadmate. "Goddamn arrow," Turk muttered before coughing up blood. He fell to one knee and would not stand despite Gregory's help. Glancing back at the fight, he watched the elves cut down the initial wave. Without their firm lines, the guards had even less chance of victory. Gregory felt his heart sink as he watched discipline waver, then break. Those who turned to flee found swords stabbing into their backs. Even worse, coming around from the back of the mansion were at least 20 elves linking up with the 6 and shredding through the remaining human forces. "Get into the house," Turk said, shoving Gregory away. "You got a chance there." "I'm not—" "Now!" Turk backhanded him, and that was enough to finally make Gregory let him go. Looking once more to the broken lines, he knew he alone could do nothing to help. Saluting Turk, he ran toward the front gate. Behind him, Turk managed to stand, and he lifted his axe defiantly as the elves came rushing by. Gregory refused to watch the ensuing execution, and he hoped the giant man might find plenty of fun in whatever world awaited him after. Bodies littered the ground as he hurried, and he felt strangely alone on the battlefield. Reaching the door, he found the majority of the city guard gathered together, at least 200. They had spread from the gate, for the elves had avoided it entirely. The gate itself, though, was open, and the sight horrified Gregory to no end. Lord Edgar's men, the trained soldiers meant to anchor their defense, were nowhere to be seen. "Where's Edgar?" he cried as he joined their ranks. "Fled, the little bitch," said their captain. "How many?" Gregory nodded behind him. 25, maybe 30. Shit. Elves appeared from both sides, Gregory's 25 and another 40 from the other direction. Outnumbered by the human forces 4-1, they should have been easy prey. But instead, the city guard tightened their lines and prepared for a slaughter. "Be brave!" several shouted, but when the elves readied their bows, Gregory knew they were in a dire situation. Break ranks and charge, or suffer the arrows. Either way meant death. This time the guards held their ground, and the few with shields did their best to protect the rest. Arrows flew in, deadly accurate. Volley after volley hit, until the elves were out of ammunition. Their opponents' ranks softened. They drew their swords, cried out in their native tongue, and charged. Gregory had never considered himself a man afraid of death, and as the elves came rushing in, he tried to remain true to that. He stood on the front line, and he braced himself to swing, trying to guess the timing instead of reading his opponent, since he'd seen how near impossible that was with the elves' speed. When he swung, he struck air, but not because his timing was off. Instead, the area before him erupted in a chaos of gray and red cloaks. The elven charge faltered, for a pair of enemies had landed amid them in an explosion of blood and gore. Not willing to risk losing such a huge advantage, Gregory rushed forward, barely aware he was screaming at the top of his lungs. The rest of the guards followed, and they slammed into the elves with wild abandon. Many of their attacks were parried or blocked, but they were a wave, and even as one fell, two more surged forward with blades already swinging. Gregory managed to cut down one too focused on dodging a man to his right. A second turned on him, kept him at bay with a shallow thrust, then tried to flee. One of the unexpected allies, a woman with a red cloak and strange, tightly wrapped clothing, dove upon the elf's back, her daggers shredding flesh. Gregory had no idea who she might be, but as the other slipped through their lines to aid the opposite side, he saw the man's garb and knew him. "The Watcher?" Gregory murmured aloud. Without thinking, he followed. The woman remained and seemed to have that side under control. The other, however. The Watcher dove into where combat was at its thickest, seemingly unafraid of the flailing weapons and press of the elves. His sabers twisted and danced, cutting down elves who were yet unaware of his arrival. He tore through the city guard like a phantom come to their aid. When he finally reached the elven lines, he let out a cry. Gregory followed, knowing the cloaked man was their only hope of survival, and he was far from alone in thinking so. The rest of the guard rushed ahead, and though the elves cut them down, the Watcher formed their spearhead, and because of it, they did not break. They did not falter. Gregory kept to the Watcher's back, hoping to help where he could, but usually just finishing off opponents the man left bleeding on the ground. Without any signal he could hear, Gregory saw the elves initiate a full retreat. He let out a whoop and held his weapon aloft. With their speed, he couldn't hope to chase, and it seemed the Watcher had no desire to either. He turned, and from what little of his face Gregory could see, he was smiling. Of the initial 200 men, a third remained, but they'd held. Gregory looked to the mansion, wondering how the people within fared. At a window, he caught a glint of light, then camouflage. His smile vanished. Without thinking, he dove forward. The arrow struck him in the chest, and he let out a gasp. As he hit the ground, the rest of the guard took up shouts, their heavy footsteps rushing into the house, where elves had no doubt entered through the windows and back entrances. Gregory felt a reflex to cough, but the pain was too incredible, and he forced it down. The Watcher leaned over him, and he mouthed a question Gregory suddenly couldn't hear. Gregory tried to speak, to tell him that it was his life the Watcher had saved from the Wraith all those nights ago. But the words were silent on his tongue, his muscle spasms beyond his control. His vision darkened. Not long after, he left to join Turk. As the fires spread, Madeline watched from the window of her room, sleeping Tori clutched to her chest. When the door opened and she saw it was Torgar, she had to bite her tongue. "Our walls are secure," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "It seems we are not their target." "Nor should we be. Laurie helped them, after all. We do share a mutual enemy in the merchant lords." Torgar grunted. Madeline refused to look at him, instead staring out the window. She rocked Tori a few times, trying hard not to show unease at the huge mercenary's presence. When he didn't leave immediately, she turned and glared. "Do you have something you wish to say?" she asked. "I do. Not that you'll listen. The merchants pulled out all their ships, and no doubt got their fighting men with them. You know what'll happen, don't you? The elves will kill Ingram, and with him dead, those boats will sail back in, just like that.
We'll have a new ruler over Angelport. How long do you think we'll survive once that happens?" Her anger grew along with her panic. How dare he try to frighten her so? "They won't dare," she insisted. "The king would be furious at them for—" "The king will be told the elves did the killing," Torgar interrupted. "And anyone who might say otherwise, anyone like you and me, will find themselves missing a head." "No," she said. "Ingram has many men at his disposal. They won't kill him, I know it. The elves will lose, and then they'll pay for their foolishness, as will the merchants for such cowardly behavior." Torgar shook his head, and his voice hardened as his patience ended. "Even if, through some miracle, Ingram survives this night, he'll still want to know why we didn't help, why we stood here and hid while the lord of our city fought for his life. Either way, you risk the noose. We must go out there. Let me take half our men. If the battle's close, we might be enough to turn the tide. The fate of Angelport will be decided tonight, and we cannot remain here and do nothing." "We can, and we will," Madeline snapped. "I am lady of the household, and you will do as I say. I control the Keenan fortune, not you. All you have is guesses. You know nothing. You're a stupid mercenary, more drunk than sober." Instead of getting angry at her outburst, Torgar only grinned. "You seem to forget a few things," he said. "Speaking of which, have you named me godfather to Tori yet?" She instinctively clutched the babe tighter. "I've had my advisors begin preparations," she said. "No," Torgar said, shaking his head. "No more stalling. I want it done now, tonight." "Tonight?" she asked, looking at him as if he were out of his mind. "Yes," he said, his grin slipping. "Tonight. Unless you want me to start telling stories to my men." Madeline felt acutely aware of how alone they were, with not even Lily there to provide witness. Swallowing, she gave him a nod. "If you insist," she said. She left the room, Torgar following closely behind her. Downstairs she found one of her advisors watching from a window, and she ordered him to bring her a quill and some parchment. As he was leaving, she caught his shoulder. "I'll want several of my guards as well," she said, "to provide witnesses." The advisor gave her a worried look, then nodded. He no doubt knew that the word of those guards would be worthless in any royal court. For her to ask meant she was in trouble. They went to the front parlor, where she found Lily. "Please take her," she said quietly as Torgar lingered behind them at the door. "Take her somewhere safe." The advisor returned, carrying both the supplies she requested as well as a group of 6 guards. They gathered behind him, their hands on their weapons. "Good. You're here," Torgar said, grinning at them. "Let's get this distraction over with, shall we? Just in case someone decides to climb our walls." Madeline felt better with the guards there, and she took the quill and dipped it in the inkwell. "What do you wish me to write?" she asked. "The obvious. State, I'm the godfather." She sat on the floor, a hardwood table before her. The light of the torches was dim, and she squinted as she wrote the letters. Normally she'd make an advisor do the work, but she knew Torgar would only accept something written in her own hand. When finished, she signed it and offered it to the mercenary. He took it, then glanced at the guards. "Jensen," he said, offering the parchment. "You can read. Tell me what that says." The guard accepted the paper, tilted it so he might see better, then frowned. "Just says you're charged to protect Tori," he said. Torgar clucked his tongue and shook his head, taking the parchment back. "Not good enough," he said. "Try again. With loose language like that, someone else might swoop in claiming to be the real godfather. Someone like, say, Stern Blackwater. You wouldn't want one of them merchant lords raising Tori, would you?" "Better them than you," thought Madeline, but she bit her tongue. "Forgive me," she said instead. "I'm not used to writing such documents." Torgar chuckled. "Sure thing, milady. Still, try again." This time she wrote the document correctly, deciding she could cancel it at any time.
Once the business with the elves and the merchants was over, the troublesome mercenary had to be the next priority. The risk was too great. Signing him godfather and protector of her granddaughter above all others, she gave it directly to Jensen, who read it aloud. Every word the man spoke was like a nail against her spine, but she consoled herself by thinking it was only temporary. It was only a stall until she could regain the upper hand. "Excellent," Torgar said, nodding as Jensen reached the end of the document. "That'll do." He lashed out, his fist striking her across the chin. She spun, her head hitting the table on her way to the ground. Spots filled her vision, and coughing, she spat blood from a bleeding lip. "Gods!" she cried, her voice weak. Looking up through tear-filled eyes, she saw them standing there, doing nothing. Torgar strode over, no more grins, no more amused expressions. His eyes were cold. She went to cry out again, but he kicked her in the teeth. "Did you see that?" Torgar said to his guards, and only then did she realize how badly she'd erred. "How about you?" She tried to stand, but he struck her again, blasting the air from her lungs and robbing her sob of any power. "It's that damn wraith again! How'd he get in here?" Another kick rolled her onto her back. Tears streamed across her face as Torgar leaned down and grabbed her by the hair. "Almost impossible to keep him from killing, ain't it?" he asked. Behind him, a couple of the guards laughed. Madeline felt ready to vomit. "Please," she whispered. "Please, don't do this." "You have no right to beg," Torgar said, glaring. "Laurie was a good man, a powerful man, and he deserved a lot better fate than what you gave him. Getting his throat cut by his own wife? Fuck. You're lucky I don't let every guard in this mansion have a turn with you for that." "Please don't hurt Tori," she pleaded, trying not to imagine such a fate. "Please, whatever you do, don't! Don't!" Torgar leaned closer, and when his grin returned, her dread only grew. "Terrace was like my own kid," he said. "I helped raise him better than you ever did. Tori's as much my grandchild as yours. I'll never hurt a hair on her head, so you can die knowing that. I'll teach her, protect her. After all, I'm her godfather, which means until she comes of age, this mansion and all its fortunes are mine." The reality hit her like one of his fists. She tried to cry out, to deny it, but Torgar drew a dagger from his belt and stabbed her in the breast. As she felt blood drip across her blouse, she saw the dagger and realized it was her own. Ash from the fireplace still covered the handle. Her mouth opened and closed silently, and then she collapsed. Her last thoughts were of Tori, and who she might become with a man like Torgar as her father. Chapter 23. As Lord Edgar's men marched through the barren city streets, forming a protective barrier of shield and blade, Ingram glanced back at his mansion and felt a tug of sorrow. "It had to be done," said Edgar beside him. "Sailors and ruffians are one thing, but an army of elves?" Ingram scowled. He understood all right, but that didn't mean he liked it. The second the attack began, Edgar had hurried into the mansion and found Ingram watching from one of the front windows. His idea had been simple, though on the cowardly side. They'd flung a helmet on Ingram's head, a coat of mail over his chest, and given him a shield. As the elves were scaling the walls, they pushed open the gates, Ingram hidden in the center of the 100 armed men. The city guard had sworn up a storm, but they could not stop them. "They might keep looking if they discover I'm not there," Ingram said, forcing himself to look away from the mansion. He kept expecting it to go up in flames at any moment. "They can look for only so long before they must flee. Daylight will not be their friend." The streets were quiet. Any man with half a mind smart enough knew that tonight was a night to remain indoors. As fast as they could march, they made for the front gates. Ingram thought Edgar meant to leave the city entirely and go against his entire treason rant earlier. But then they veered aside to a path that ended at one of the walls. "In there," Edgar said, gesturing to a plain-looking home. It had a single window, the glass broken and the back of it boarded up. "You should be safe." Ingram took a step, something feeling amiss. "Where is this?" he asked. "A safe house I've kept ever since the Wraith started killing. Hurry. We can't stay in the open for long, else we'll be noticed." Ingram tested the door and found it unlocked. Pushing it open, he entered the small room. A round table was in the center, a lit candle atop it in a glass base. The fireplace burned bright, casting long shadows across the far wall. At the back, a set of stairs led to the second floor. In one of the two chairs sat a man Ingram did not recognize. He reached for a weapon but realized he carried none, only a shield. He didn't remember forfeiting his dagger. Had it been when they put on his mail? The door shut behind him, and the sound sent shivers up his spine. "Who is this?" Ingram asked. "What's going on?" The man in the chair stood. He was dark-skinned, bearded, with a long scar running from his lip to his chin. He sipped hard liquor from a bottle, while in his left hand he held a long blade. "Glad to see you're a man of your word," he said, setting the bottle down atop the table. Ingram pulled the shield off his back, and for a moment he stood there shaking. The stranger laughed as behind him the door reopened. "Make it quick, Darrell," said Edgar, his voice suddenly different. It was darker, angrier. "We have much still to do." The door shut, leaving Ingram alone with the brute. "Traitor," he muttered, eliciting a laugh from Darrell. "To you, maybe," said the man, tossing the weapon hand to hand, his grin so big he looked like a child given a cherished present. "But we've been paying him plenty, and for years. I'm thinking he might be the most loyal man in this city." Ingram lifted the shield, his face nothing but a mask of fear. Darrell slapped at it with his sword, which Ingram barely blocked in time. The big man shook his head as if disappointed. "This is going to be way too easy." When he pulled his sword back to stab, Ingram gave him no reason to think otherwise. But when he thrust again, Ingram launched himself forward. The sword hit the center of the shield and veered outward. Distance closed. Ingram rammed his knee into Darrell's crotch, then followed it with an uppercut with his free hand. The man staggered backward on unsteady legs. "You little shit!" Darrell cried, grabbing his sword with both hands and swinging. Ingram moved his shield to block, but he guessed too high. The sword clipped the bottom before continuing on, striking his mail shirt. The weapon could not cut through, but the block knocked the air from his lungs and sent him sprawling into the table. Dropping the shield, Ingram fell to the ground, the killing blow missing and instead embedding a solid inch into the wood. Beneath the table, Ingram kicked out Darrell's knee, and as he fell, he took another shot at the man's crotch, this time with his heel. The effect was better the second time round. Darrell fell to both knees, and he had to grab the table to remain upright. Despite his trouble breathing, with several of his ribs cracked or broken, Ingram flung himself at the man, wrapping his arms around his neck. The two hit the ground and rolled. In the scuffle, Ingram found himself flung off, with Darrell lying on his chest before the fireplace. "Stay down," Ingram said, kicking him in the ribs. Darrell dropped, but he pushed up again. Knowing he stood little chance in a prolonged fight, Ingram crawled closer, then wrapped his arms around Darrell's neck again. Darrell's enormous fists closed about his arms, and they struggled. But Ingram had the better positioning. Inch by inch, he lowered Darrell's face. Then, at the last moment, he twisted and flung him forward. Darrell's face smashed into the burning coals, eliciting a howl that chilled Ingram to the core. It took all his strength to hold the man there for a moment longer. When he released, he scrambled for what lay beside him on the floor, the spilled bottle Darrell had been drinking from when they first entered. As Darrell rolled himself out of the fire, Ingram took the bottle by the neck, turned, and swung it with both hands. It smashed against Darrell's nose, crunching it inward before the bottle broke against his skull. Alcohol splashed across his face and beard, igniting a few coals that had remained lodged against him. His beard caught fire first, followed by the rest. As the man howled and flailed, Ingram staggered toward the steps. There was no way Edgar would leave the front entrance unguarded, not until he saw a body. But perhaps up top, he might escape. He climbed the stairs to the second floor. The room was even smaller, the roof slanted in sharp angles. Within was a dresser, a bed, and an open, dirt-covered window. On the bed, as if he'd been waiting for him the whole while, sat the Wraith.
"You lasted this long,"
the Wraith said.
"I will give you credit for that."
His sword lashed out, cleanly slicing through Ingram's throat. He collapsed, clutching his neck as blood gushed through his fingers. Gasping for air, he saw the Wraith lean over, a sad smile on his face.
"I would have saved you from their treachery, Ingram. Truly I would have. But then you weakened and dared to offer peace. So disappointing."
As he died, Ingram watched the Wraith leap out the window and into the bloody night. Upon seeing his own kind besieging Ingram's mansion, Diridan felt torn between loyalty and fury. Surely such a brazen attack had not been condoned by Graven, nor Ne'ivar Sinistel. He'd heard of the attempt at the jail, and best he could tell, it had been initiated by Larissa. His gut told him Larissa had done the same tonight. The attack might as well be a declaration of war, something she had no authority to do. But at the same time, as the humans battled and fired their crossbows, he watched many elves, some he'd known for hundreds of years, fall and bleed out on the grass. The sight was enough to make his stomach sick. He knelt from the rooftop of a nearby home, just barely able to peer over the stone wall.
"This is your doing,"
Diridan said, shaking his head.
"I won't help you start a war, Larissa."
He wanted to go but could not. He watched the ebb and flow of the fight, which at first was drastically in the elves' favor despite their fewer numbers. The humans gathered at the front for what appeared to be their last hurrah before dying in a blur of elven steel. But then they arrived. Diridan had never seen the woman before, but the man spinning and slashing with those sabers could be no one else. His movements were too fluid, his skill far beyond what any normal human could hope to attain. Suddenly things became far clearer in Diridan's mind. He might not support Larissa in her attempts at a pointless war, but to see the one who'd nearly killed elven royalty now slaughtering elven troops? Leaping off the rooftop, he hit the ground and rolled, his long, ornate knives flashing into his hands. He wished he had his bow, but he'd left the enormous thing in hiding outside Angelport, knowing he couldn't carry it around without drawing immediate attention. Still, his knives would be sufficient, despite the Watcher's surprising skill. Not many opponents fought Diridan and lived for a second encounter. Despite his speed, Diridan kept his approach low and hidden, wanting no one, not even the other elves, to know of his presence. Should word get back to Quelazar that he had witnessed the battle and not helped, there'd be many eager to deem him a coward and a traitor. He had no intention of delving into that type of political nonsense. As he was halfway there, smoke billowed out the windows of the mansion, and elves fled from all directions. One side or the other had set it aflame, though Diridan couldn't begin to guess which. He dove into the cover of shadows as they fled, and he waited. The Watcher vaulted over the wall in chase, and Diridan followed him in return. Far down an alley, his target having eluded him, the Watcher slowed. Diridan did not. Only sheer honor kept him from stabbing the man in the back. Someone who fought with such skill deserved to die in fair combat.
"Watcher!"
Diridan called mere seconds before he launched himself into an attack. The human spun, his cloaks whipping about. His eyes widened at the sight of him, and Diridan felt the tiniest amusement at the worry he saw. Even against the Watcher, Diridan still carried a frightening reputation. Their blades clashed, and this time Diridan was prepared for his speed. He settled into an attack routine, keeping on the offense. At last, the Watcher tried for a riposte, and Diridan slid into the opening. His foot shot out, connecting against the human's chin.
"Blow for blow,"
Diridan said, grinning despite the horror of the night. Armies of humans might soon march upon their forests, But at least for now he could fight an opponent of equal skill and know the human deserved death. The Watcher didn't seem as amused. He fled toward a nearby building. Grabbing the side of a low-hanging roof, he vaulted atop it. As Diaradon was about to follow, his finely honed instincts cried out in warning. Instead, he dropped back down and spun, his knives already out to parry. The red-cloaked woman slammed into him, her daggers ringing as Diaradon parried slash after slash. Her speed was nearly equal to the Watcher's, but it was her fluidity that struck him, and as he launched an offensive to ensure she couldn't pin his back to the building, he felt as if he were fighting another elf. Her skill with the daggers, however, was not anywhere as finely honed. He parried a thrust to the side, stabbing with his right hand. She twisted and should have avoided his thrust, but it was just a feint. Instead, he closed the distance between them, batting both her daggers outward when she tried to bring them in. Her defenses broken, Diaradon pulled back for a killing thrust. The Watcher's heel slammed into his shoulder before he could. Sabers slashed the air where he'd been as Diaradon rolled with the blow, then leaped twice to give himself some space. Both the Watcher and the woman faced him, their weapons clutched tightly in their hands. Diaradon tensed, realizing that, skilled as he was, combined they posed too dangerous a fight. "I have no quarrel with you," he said to the woman. "Nor I with you," she said, her body slanting lower. "But you're not killing Hern." She attacked, and the Watcher followed. Her daggers danced like snakes, and Diaradon could only defend against them with just his left hand, for the Watcher assaulted the other side. The elf felt his skills tested as never before, twisting and shifting as his two knives blocked and parried with nearly every movement he made. The woman increased her ferocity, but Diaradon faked a counter, then launched himself at the Watcher. The two intertwined, a chaotic clash of blades, kicks, and punches. Blood flew. Diaradon rolled away, his chest stinging from a shallow cut. The Watcher fared no better, two fresh wounds bleeding from his left arm. The woman came at him, refusing to give him rest. He blocked her daggers, shoved them aside, and then caught her with his hilts on the way back. As her body twisted with the blow, he kicked out, delivering a satisfying hit to her midsection. She let out a cry as she staggered away. Diaradon took the time to gain some distance between them and catch his breath. The Watcher looked ready for another attack, his legs braced for a leap. "Why do you hunt me?" the man asked, shifting the angle of his sabers every few minutes to ensure Diaradon did not anticipate his next move. "I have never struck at elves before tonight." "You stabbed Larissa and left her dead. There will be no courts for you, no lies, only justice." Justice? Diaradon took advantage of the man's confusion, breaking into a dead run. When the woman tried to intervene, he slide-kicked, forcing her to leap away to avoid his low slash. He rolled once, then kicked out of it with his knives leading. The Watcher was ready, unafraid to meet his charge. Knife and saber collided, the alley ringing with the sound of their contact. Diaradon's arms weaved at the very limits of their speed, and the Watcher met him blow for blow. Each scored another pair of cuts, shallow wounds that would do little else other than bleed. Again came the damn woman, forcing Diaradon to split his attention. This time the Watcher did not fall for a feint needed to buy him separation. The elf knew he must flee, but the two pressed, eventually linking up side to side as they stabbed and thrust. Diaradon's knives were a twisting blur, viciously slamming away every attempted hit. At last, they overextended, and instead of countering, Diaradon tried to run. He underestimated their speed. The woman kicked out a leg, and as he rolled, another foot connected with his sides. He continued until striking a wall, hitting his head hard. As he felt his balance tremble, he stumbled to one knee, still attempting to block the killing blow, but it did not come. Not yet. "Justice," said the Watcher, sounding very much out of breath. "I never attacked Larissa, you fool. How is killing me justice?" "Your mark," Diaradon said, slowly standing. His stomach was doing flips, but he tried to keep a calm facade. "You drew it in her own blood." "My mark? How do you know that, Diaradon? Who told you?" The Watcher's apparent confusion left Dioradan puzzled. He'd thought the symbol common knowledge, a well-known calling. What was this man trying to get at before killing him?
"Our ambassador," Dioradan said, refusing to lie. "He said the open eye is yours."
The Watcher glanced once at the woman, and she mouthed the name Elisa. He stood up straight, falling out of his combat stance. "Listen to me, Elf, and listen closely. I have not used that symbol for nearly 2 years, and when I did, it was hundreds of miles from here in Veldaren, a city of humans. Here in Angelport, only one man has used that symbol, the man calling himself Wraith. Tell me, Dioradan, how does your ambassador know that eye was first mine?"
"How does he know?"
Suddenly it was Dioradan's turn to be confused. Neither the woman nor the Watcher looked ready to kill him despite their conflict. Trying to force his mind to work through the pain, he shook his head. No. What they were insinuating, it couldn't be right. "I didn't come here to cause a war," the Watcher insisted. "I didn't attack Larissa." "You must trust me."
"And why would I dare trust a human?"
The Watcher looked to the distance, and he clearly had something pressing on his mind. "Because I can prove my innocence," he said. He pointed at him with the tip of his saber. "What will it be?" Dioradan looked to them both, stood to his full height, and then answered. Chapter 24. Herrn rushed through the quiet streets as fast as his tired legs could carry him. Not far behind hurried Zusa, limping slightly after the brutal kick she'd suffered. They weaved through back alleys, doing everything they could to maintain a straight path. What time they had was limited, and it might already be too late. When they arrived at the safe house given to them, Herrn paused to gather his breath. Heart in his throat, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The Wraith leaned against the far wall, his arms crossed. The unhidden lower part of his face was wrapped in a smile. Elisa was nowhere to be seen.
"About time," said the Wraith. "I expected you here far sooner."
"Why?" Herrn asked as Zusa slipped in beside him. "How could you betray us so?" The Wraith pulled off his hood. When he spoke, his voice changed, more forceful and deep.
"That is such a vague question,"
said Graven, pulling his sword off his back. "You'll need to do better." "Where is Elisa?" Zusa asked, taking a step forward. Graven turned and directed his smile to her. "Such care, such love. You've been an unexpected nuisance, Zusa, but not enough to truly cause any worry. If you want to find Elisa, she's hanging from a post at the docks. It shouldn't be long before the merchants have her. I doubt her fate will be kind once those ships land, nor will it be very long." Zusa drew her daggers, and they shook in her hands. "I thought you wanted peace," Herrn said, freeing his own blades. "I thought you never wanted war." "Ignore the words I've spoken as a politician, Watcher, and think on what I told you in Ingram's prison. This city is wretched, a blight on Desrel. It's full of hate, murder, and it will only grow worse when Violet floods its streets. I've done what's needed to set things right, every step I've taken, even as our ambassador has brought us closer to war. We'll burn Angelport to the ground, all of it. There's still time for you to join me. We do not have to be enemies." "I need to get to the docks," Zusa whispered, and Herrn nodded. "Go," he told her, "and may Ashur help us all." With her gone, Graven paced before him, watching, mocking. "You won't win on your own," he said. "I know." Dioradan stepped in through the open door, knives in hand. Seeing him, Graven sadly shook his head. You've always been incapable of performing the simplest tasks."
"Why did you bring me here?" Dioradon asked. "Why strike at our royalty? Would you slaughter Ceridon's own daughter to achieve your ends?"
"I never touched her," Graven said, anger flaring in his eyes for the first time. "I twisted her tragedy to help my cause, and it sickened my stomach doing even that. As for why? You've lived among the humans. You've seen their destructive behavior, their riots, their sins. Surely you understand what I have done, what still needs to be done. Those who would work for peace, even those with our own blood, must suffer for their delusions." Dioradon settled into a combat stance, and it was answer enough. Graven sighed. "You can't defeat me," he said, pulling his hood back over his face. Shadows enclosed all but his eyes and mouth, and his voice immediately changed. "I've always been the better, but my station has never given me a chance to prove it. Besides, it would have been an insult for me to challenge someone so low-born as yourself. I'd hoped the Watcher would kill you. Nothing would have given me greater pleasure than to spread word of how your legacy ended at the hands of a human." Dioradon launched himself at Graven, and Hairn remained behind to wait for an opening. The room was cramped, and it'd be difficult for them to fight side by side. Graven's sword connected with the knives hard enough to send sparks floating to the ground. The two exchanged hits, and Hairn felt a chill crawl up his spine at the sight. He knew Dioradon's skill, having so recently received a painful lesson in the elf's abilities. Yet as the two elves battled, Hairn knew who was the better. Graven had told no lie. He was the superior fighter. His sword weaved and feinted like a true extension of his body. With every stab and slash Dioradon made, he found himself out of position. Not by a lot, and he always recovered or pulled his slashes back to block a fatal blow. But all it'd take was one mistake and he'd be bleeding out on the floor. Which meant he had to help. When Dioradon fell back, Hairn stepped in, his surprise attack as ineffective as he'd expected. Graven parried it away, forced his sabers up to block what turned out to be a feint, and then brought his attention back to Dioradon. The two exchanged another set of blows, adding a slight gash across Dioradon's arm, before Graven had to return to the defensive, parrying and blocking their four weapons with his one with amazing skill. Still, against two powerful opponents in the cramped space, his maneuvers were limited, and Graven knew it. Just as they were about to corner him, the elf lunged at Hairn, startling him with his sudden, vicious speed. Hairn failed to parry the sword in time, only shifting its aim so that instead of piercing his heart, it slashed across the bones in his shoulder. It stung like the abyss, and Hairn fell away in fear of an onslaught. Instead, Graven bolted for the door, Dioradon at his heels. Hairn clutched his shoulder, forced the pain back into the recesses of his mind, and then ran, all the while knowing he could never match either of their speed. But he had to try. No matter what, the Wraith had to die tonight. The salty air stung as it blew against the cuts on Elisa's arms. That pain was the first thing she noticed as consciousness returned to her. The second was the realization that she hung from the air by her wrists, putting painful pressure on her shoulders and back. Last was of how Graven had betrayed her far worse than anyone in her life had before. He'd come in the middle of the night, while she'd sat awake atop her bed, unable to sleep. "What's happening out there?" she'd asked him. In response, he'd smiled, offered her his hand, and then struck her across the face upon accepting it. Two more blows came, and then darkness followed. Her eyes fluttered open, and she saw the heavy shadows of boats, lit by a few carefully protected lanterns. Fear clawed at her heart as she realized those shadows were growing ever close. The merchant lords were coming home to port. "Help!" she cried weakly, hardly a whisper. She struggled against the rope, twisting her body about so she might glance deeper into the city. "Help!" The second scream was better, but it still seemed weak. Worse than the pervading silence about her was the unnatural quiet that enveloped the city. No one was about. No one would come to save her. Tears rolled down her cheeks. This was it. This was how she'd die. She couldn't begin to understand why the elf had betrayed her, though as the boats neared, she wondered if the merchants had offered him a bounty. Perhaps the elves figured her dying was good enough, regardless of whether it was at their hands or the merchants'. Maybe Graven wasn't as ardent in his belief of her innocence. In the end, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the cold, triumphant smile on Warwick's son's face as he stepped down the plank and onto the dock. Armed sailors and mercenaries accompanied him. More boats arrived, and amid the din, Warwick approached. She hung from a heavy post, the rope expertly tied about her wrists, so that her squirming only tightened it. The old man cupped her face in his gnarled hand so she would look him in the eye. She made no attempt to hide her revulsion at his touch.
"Ah, Alisa," said Warwick. "We have some business arrangements to discuss. I hope you don't mind."
She refused to respond. Men came from the other boats, some of whom she recognized.
"Goddamn," said Stern, shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't believe the Wraith actually kept his word. A fine gift indeed."
"Cut her down," Warwick told one of his men. A ruffian pulled out his dagger and began sawing at the thick ropes. When it finally snapped, he caught her, not out of any inclination to protect her from the fall, but just to have a grab at her breasts. He set her on the ground, then backed away. Alisa pulled her hands free from the rest of the bonds. Trying to be brave, she stood before Warwick with her back straight, her arms at her sides, and addressed him with a firm tone. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked. "What is it you think you'll gain?"
"We stand to gain much," Warwick said. "Tonight is the night we celebrate our ascension to lords and rulers of both Angelport and the rest of the Ramir. Not just that, though. We'll celebrate the complete and total dissolution of the Trifect."
Alisa swallowed down her fear. "Killing me accomplishes nothing," she said. "My son still lives, and make no mistake, he will hunt you down and slaughter you all once he comes of age." Stern backhanded her, looking almost bored as he did it. She spat at him, feeling her cheek already starting to swell.
"Try not to be so short-sighted," he told her.
"What about you?" Alisa asked. "It's your granddaughter who will eventually suffer for all this, yet you call me short-sighted?"
"She'll inherit sooner than you think," Stern said. "And free of you, Tori's fate will be far better. We'll be her allies now. Not you, not the Conningtons. Here in Angelport she'll flourish, free of your influence, free of the games you play in Veldaren."
"What makes you think—" Warwick cleared his throat to interrupt her, then reached into his coat. From it he pulled out a heavy, unsealed scroll. He offered it to her, and she reluctantly took it. As the rest watched, she unrolled it and read. Written in a careful hand that had to be Warwick's own, the wording was simple, the scroll addressed to King Edwin. In it, she declared that the Trifect no longer existed, negating all trading agreements made with the other members and swearing to make no similar allegiances for a span of 20 years. "This will mean nothing. Not forced at knife point," she said. "The others of the Trifect will know, and their wrath will be terrible."
"Terrible?"
Warwick asked, and his smile was ugly and full of missing teeth.
"Is that so? Come now. Who could refute this if key nobles bore witness?"
"What witnesses could possibly matter?"
"The head of the Keenan wealth."
Alisa's sense of betrayal grew. First, Madeline had tried to kill her, and now she'd shatter the Trifect to pieces, despite the hundreds of years it had existed. Why? What madness had taken over her? She stood there, rubbing her sore wrists, and looked to the streets. Sure enough, She saw a large group of mercenaries coming their way. If only Laurie were alive, she thought, he never would have let something so terrible happen. She expected Madeline to be amid the group, but she saw only Torgar leading the way. "Where is Madeline?" she asked, confused, as Torgar came up to them and bowed.
"Such a shame, that," Torgar said, grinning. "The Wraith killed her, just like he killed her husband. Looks like little Tori's in charge, but I'm her godfather, so I'll be watching over things until she comes of age."
Elisa's mouth dropped open. The entire Keenan wealth. In the hands of this drunken oaf? What was Madeline thinking? Dumbfounded, she watched as Warwick took the scroll from her hands and gave it to Torgar along with a small quill. Torgar signed his X at the bottom, then handed both back.
"We have no need of your help," Torgar said to Elisa. "You can stay up in Valderin and rot. Same with all the Conningtons. There's far better friends for us down here. Ain't that right, Stan?"
Stern crossed his arms, and despite Torgar's grin, he seemed none too happy with the brute.
"I expect Tori to be well cared for," he said, "and we will have much to discuss, you and I." "Sure thing," said Torgar. "We have all the time in the world."
Elisa watched it all as a numbness crawled through her mind. It felt as if ice water ran through her veins. With Elisa's forced agreement and Torgar's own eager signing, that meant 2 of the 3 members of the trifect were accepting total dissolution. Even if the Connington family could appoint a leader to the household in time to challenge it, there'd be little anyone could do. Everything they'd built up over centuries would collapse. It'd be over, all of it, and the merchants would be there waiting to pick up the pieces.
"We have all the witnesses we need," Warwick said, turning back to Elisa. "Now, will you sign, or must we become more persuasive?"
They'd torture her, she knew. How long until she broke? Because she would. In time, with enough pain, anyone would. But even knowing that, she could not bring herself to relent. Not to scum like them.
"I won't," she said. "I don't care what it is you've done. I won't sign. My son will inherit a fortune, not the pauper's kingdom you'd leave him with. Consider me rejecting your proposal."
"Stubborn as always," Stern said, gesturing for one of his larger men to come over.
"But you'll see wisdom in this agreement. Bind her again, and take her to the water."
When they grabbed her arms and pulled them behind her back, she refused to give them the satisfaction of a struggle. They tied her wrists tight, wrapped the rope about her waist, and then dragged her to the edge of the dock. A heavy blow sent her to her knees, and a foot blasted the air from her lungs. As she lay on the sea-worn wood, she felt the rope wrapping about her ankles.
"Have a good swim,"
the ruffian said, then tossed her off the pier. She gasped in air before the freezing water enveloped her, shockingly cold. The pressure around her waist tightened, and she felt disorientated as something pulled her upward, but only halfway. Her legs emerged, but her upper half remained below water, and as the air burned in her chest, she clenched her teeth and squirmed. Her skin started to numb, and flashes of color swam across her eyelids. At last she could hold it in no more, and gasped in water. Her insides roiled, and as she gagged and spurted, they lifted her up and out.
"So," said Warwick, kneeling at the edge of the dock as Elisa coughed up icy water. "What do you think of our counter-proposal?"
She spoke, but her lips were trembling, her lungs too busy gasping in air to make much noise. Warwick leaned closer.
"What was that?"
"Bastard!"
"I thought so."
They dropped her again, and this time she wasn't able to prepare. The cold was almost welcome, a numbing sensation overwhelming her raw nerves throughout her body. All but her lungs. They felt aflame, and she had to resist the desire to open her mouth and let the water pour in, lest it be the last breath she ever took. She endured, and when they pulled her out, she managed another desperate gasp before they dunked her back in. Still, that one was the worst of all. Her head pounded from the blood rushing into it, her legs trembled and shook in the exposed air, and her nostrils ached from the water pouring into them and then pooling in the back of her throat. All thoughts of resisting fled from her mind. They'd continue to dunk her, spend all night if they needed, until she cracked. Here she was, her lungs about to burst, and it was just the third time. How would she survive another 10 minutes? 20? An hour? For Nathaniel, she thought, I'll do it for my son. Even if it meant dying a cold, ignoble death, she'd make sure his fortune survived. In and out of the water, every breath a sweet gift that was never enough. At last she could hardly think, could hardly feel, and it was then they pulled her onto the docks and left her lying there, soaked and shivering. Warwick knelt over her, and when he put his hand on her cheek, she felt nothing. I ask for only what is right, my dear Elisa, he said to her, and in her waterlogged ears it almost sounded like he was trying to feign paternal affection. The trifecta's dominated for too many years, and it's time for the rest of Neldar to trade, barter, and live without your iron control over their lives. You've ruled by your heritage, lasted on a wealth prepared for you decades before your birth. But the old guard must crumble and die. You may mock us for calling ourselves lords, but despite our lack of lands, our lack of noble birth, we carry far more influence than anyone else here in the Remir. It is our agility, our determination, our ruthlessness that you cannot hope to match. We thrive because we are your betters, not because we were born into such a position. We are the future, Elisa, not you. Now, will you sign? Elisa lay with her cheek pressed against the wood and with red eyes watched a shadow crawl across a rooftop in the not-so-far distance. I won't, she said, her voice cracking. And you won't make me. Is that so? Asked Warwick. What makes you so certain? Because you'll be dead. And then Zusa landed amid them, her daggers unleashing a bloody spray from the bodies around her. Elisa watched, unable to move. The faceless woman was a true spectacle, dipping and weaving through a crowd of nearly 50 men. In all her time, Elisa had never seen her fight in such a way, not even when battling the dark paladin Ethric, or protecting her from the various thieves who made attempts on her life. She made no blocks or parries, instead relying on pure speed to carry her through. She dodged and twisted, and her daggers sliced through throats and plunged into eye sockets and chests. "Stop her!" Stern cried out beside her. Elisa tilted her head, trying to follow. The men had managed to regroup after the surprise attack, and they lashed at her with their weapons. Zeus's progress slowed, many of her attacks missing or being blocked. Still, the bodies gathered, and Elisa dared to hope. Panicking, Stern grabbed her by the hair and put a dagger to her throat. "Won't stop her," Elisa muttered, and it seemed Stern realized that as well. The battle shifted, and Elisa saw that Zusa was bleeding, her wrappings torn, with many hanging by threads. Still, she battled, now on the defensive. They left her nowhere to run, but then she vaulted over them, sailing into the sky as if the world could not contain her. She landed so close to Elisa that she wanted to reach out, to merely touch her to confirm she was real. But then Torgar was there, and his giant fist caught Zusa across the side of the head. Zusa staggered, and he followed it up with a roundhouse across the face. As the faceless woman collapsed, Torgar took his blade and prepared to stab. "No!" Elisa screamed. Torgar paused and looked her way. He kicked away Zeus's daggers, then rested his foot atop her throat. Warwick grabbed Elisa by the neck and hefted her to her feet with surprising strength for his age. "You value her life, then, if not your own?" he asked. "Then sign, right now, or I will make you watch as that brute cuts strips of her flesh off one by one. I'll make you wear them, Elisa, just as that lady over there garbs herself with cloth." Zeus's eyes were unfocused and gazing up at the sky. Elisa felt tears running down her face. Torgar grinned at her, and he put the tip of his sword against Zeus's palm and pressed. Zeus screamed, and Elisa did as well. "I will!" she cried. "Please, don't kill her. I'll sign whatever you wish." Warwick's smile spread ear to ear. "That's a smart girl. Get her a quill." They untied her wrists, and one of the ruffians had to hold her so she could stand. Her hands shook violently, so much that Stern brought over a torch and held it below her wrists. Elisa stared at Zeusa the whole while, at the pain on her face as blood spilled from her palm. Torgar twisted the edge, seemingly for no other reason than malicious glee. Zeusa did not cry out, and as feeling returned to Elisa's fingers, she refused to cry out as well, despite the throbbing agony it awoke. When at last she could hold the quill steady, they presented her the scroll. Before she could sign it, one of the men called out and the rest looked to the north. A large squad of soldiers marched their way, and Elisa dared to hope. She recognized that banner. Lord Edgar, one of the most powerful lords sworn to Lord Ingram. They'd come armed for battle, and she had no doubt as to their foe. Ingram had finally sent his men to slaughter the merchant lords like the pests they were. He'd finally come to prove that he ruled Angelport, not them. She wanted to call to them, to cheer, but she was so tired, and Torgar's blade remained pressed against Zeusa's flesh, his heel against her slender neck. Warwick, however, appeared unworried, and that gave her pause. When the troops neared, the rest gave way, letting Lord Edgar walk without conflict up to Warwick's son, draw his sword, and then kneel. As his knee touched the dock, the last hope in Elisa's heart died. "The city's yours," Edgar said, rising. "Ingram is dead." "You've done well," Warwick said. "Your rewards have already been great, and they will grow greater still. The people have rallied to our side, and in this chaos we will be the ones seen bringing about order. In time, even the king will accept my appointing as Lord and Protector of Angelport. I promise you, Edgar, your rewards then will be far greater than Ingram ever doled out." "You can start with giving me yours lands," Edgar said. "He might have recently perished due to my sword getting shoved down his throat." "Of course," Warwick said, and he looked disgustingly amused. "Of course." Edgar looked at Elisa, and then he bowed low. "Forgive me if I am intruding," he said, grinning. "No intrusion," said Stern. "Elisa was just about to sign an agreement, and you'd make another fine witness should she try to renege on it before the king. But of course. Go on then, Elisa. Sign. We're all here." Elisa felt trapped, helpless. She took the quill, the scroll, and read through it once more. Every line meant the dissolution of years of trade. It meant the halt of all minimum prices on the bulk of their goods. It meant the end of the safety and strength of the trifect. They'd be on their own, competing against one another, as well as struggling to recover as all the while the merchant lords swarmed north in attempts to steal away every last coin. But not signing it meant the loss of her life and Zeusa's. She'd never get to see her son again. Whatever strength she'd had, it meant nothing now. She took the quill, signed her name, and then let it drop to the dock. "There," she said, "it is done. Now let me and Zeusa go." "Not quite," said Warwick, who nodded at Torgar. The man chuckled, pulled back his sword, and slashed Zeusa across the stomach. Elisa's vision exploded with red. She screamed. She flung herself at Torgar, but he let go of the blade and grabbed her by the throat. "You wanna hurt me, bitch?" he asked, punching her in the gut. As she leaned over and gagged, she heard Warwick speaking to Lord Edgar. "Send her to the elves," said the old man. "We'll need to pacify them so we can solidify our control over the Remir. I can't imagine a better gift." "No," Elisa said, trying to deny the unfairness of it all. "You hear that?" Torgar said, pulling her closer so he could growl into her ear. "You're going to lose your head for attacking that cute little elven slut.
And you know what's best? That was me. My sword. You'll die for my crimes, you stupid cunt, while I rule over Laurie's fortune. I can't imagine a better, more proper fate for a stuffed-up highborn like you." With that, he let her head drop back to the wet wooden planks. "Torga, enough!" Stern yelled when he reached for her again. Through blurred vision, Elisa saw the two glaring and did not understand. Turning her eyes down, she saw Zusa lying close, facing her. Her body was trembling, one wrapped hand holding back the bleeding, the other reaching toward her. Elisa reached back, and their fingers touched. "I'm so sorry," Elisa whispered. "You three," said Stern, gesturing to men about him. "Take her." Several men grabbed her, lifting her to her feet. They were dragging her away, to the castle, to its dungeon. When they were almost out of sight, she managed to steal a look back. Zusa lay on the dock in a pool of her own blood, all but forgotten. Chapter 25. The Wraith fled down the streets, and Deirodon gave chase. More than ever, he wished he'd brought his bow with him instead of stashing it. Against someone like Graven, taking him down at a distance seemed the wisest and safest course of action. Instead, he had to close in, and when Graven climbed to the rooftops, he had to follow. They leaped across them, heading away from the docks. The homes crowded together, their roofs forming a slanted, uneven road for them to race upon. As Graven reached a street, he tensed as if to leap over, but then spun. Deirodon twirled his knives in hand. By most, he was considered the finest fighter of elven kind. He showed no fear, no hesitation, regardless of the opponent. He would show none now. They clashed together, this time with far more room to duel than in the home. Despite the unevenness of the footing, Deirodon felt better with the open space. Wielding two weapons to Graven's one should have granted him an advantage. But Graven kept on the offensive, striking with so much strength that Deirodon could not block with just one hand, nor parry with his thin, light knives. His only hope was in a counter, but every time he ducked underneath a blow and moved to attack, Graven had already pulled back or shifted his blade for a thrust. Deirodon still kept on, refusing to back down. But he was bleeding and had suffered wounds fighting Hairn and Zusa. As the fight progressed, each second an agonizing whirlwind of parry and thrust, slash and dodge, he feared what he'd always known. Graven was his equal, if not his superior. The sword swung low, and when Deirodon blocked it with both his blades, he tried stepping in to close the distance between them. Graven continued pressing, forcing the blades to remain low, and then his head shot out, ramming Deirodon's nose with his forehead. As stars exploded in his vision, he tried leaping away, but Graven caught him with his fist. Using his elbow to knock Deirodon's thrust aside, he rammed his forearm into his throat. Blind and gagging, Deirodon made one last desperate stab, which amounted to nothing. Graven somersaulted away, his foot catching Deirodon's chin. The blow jammed his teeth shut, and he felt a piece of his tongue tear. Blood spilled warm across his mouth. Deirodon fell to one knee, spitting out a tiny chunk of flesh. His breath came in ragged, and he glared at Graven as the other elf slowly stalked closer. "You shame us all," he said. "I do what must be done. I do what we should have done centuries ago. We can no longer overlook the threat humans present to us, nor the evil they carry in their hearts. Look what they did to our Desrin brethren. They sent mobs carrying fire and blade, and despite all our skill, all our magic, we still had to flee. I was there, Deirodon. I watched the smoke spread for hundreds of miles. I watched our children taken down by thousands of arrows. And now the people of Angelport press our borders, and many of us would kneel and present them our necks, all the better for our executioners. I won't let it happen, damn them all! I won't let it!" Deirodon flung his knives in the way as Graven's blade descended. His arms jarred at the contact, and he felt the muscles in his neck and chest tighten as he fought against its downward progress. Graven knelt with all his weight into it, his feet positioned so that even if Deirodon tried to kick them out, he'd still be able to dodge in time.
Closer and closer came the tip, its edge shifting so it aimed straight for his left eye. And then it thrust, accompanied by a shriek of metal as it slid across his knives. It stabbed the rooftop instead, shoved upward by Diridon at the last moment. He kicked for Graven's knee, but instead hit only air. The two were both badly positioned, flailing for footing, but it was Graven who recovered first. The sword slashed across Diridon's chest twice, and as he stumbled back, Graven stepped in behind him and cut the back of his leg. The pain was incredible. Crumpling to one knee, he tried to defend, but Graven smacked the weapons aside as if they were playthings. Another cut, this one on his arm. Diridon fell to his back, Graven hovering over him, smiling out from the shadows of his hood.
"I told you I was the better," he said. "It's a shame no one else will ever know."
Diridon flung his knives, which Graven parried aside. He slapped him across the face with the flat of his blade as if rebuking a student.
"Maybe,"
Diridon said, laying his head atop the roof.
"But you forgot someone."
With a flutter of cloaks, the Watcher arrived, looking like Graven's reflection in the fading starlight. Hairn landed atop the roof, his sabers drawn and his pulse pounding. Diridon had clearly been defeated, but he looked alive, so at least there was that. Bracing his legs, he prepared for an attack should Graven make the slightest threatening motion toward Diridon. "Step away," he commanded. Graven only laughed.
"Why?" he asked. "Do you care for him? Have you ever seen him before? He is our dog, our hunting beast. You shouldn't mourn his loss."
I said step away. Graven angled his sword so the tip pressed against Diridon's throat.
"Of the two of us, I don't think you're the one in a position to make demands, Watcher."
Hairn took a single step, watching Diridon as much as he was Graven. Another step and the tip pressed tighter against flesh. "This won't end how you want it," said Hairn.
"I beg to differ."
Diridon met his gaze, and in the slightest of nods, he saw the order to attack. Hairn lunged, and before Graven could execute him, Diridon batted aside the sword with his arms, accepting the vicious cut it dealt him. With him rolling away, Graven could not follow, for in came Hairn on the attack. His sabers connected with Graven's long blade, and the ringing noise it created was like a death knell in Hairn's mind. His primal instincts took over. His sabers slashed low and high, Graven batting aside the low while ducking underneath the other. Spinning, his sword slashed for Hairn's knees, but he spun himself, avoiding the cut as well as flinging his cloak into Graven's face. Graven took the offensive once he could see, using every advantage of his longer reach. Hairn parried several strikes with both his sabers, trying to adjust to the elf's vicious speed, then attempted to go on the offensive. His sabers lashed out, but he still hadn't judged correctly. Graven batted both aside, stepped close, and then rammed his elbow into Hairn's throat. As he gagged, Graven struck again, this time with the hilt of his sword atop his head. Hairn collapsed to his knees, and he expected a flash of pain as the elven steel claimed his life, but it did not. Instead, Graven paced before him, just outside the reach of his sabers.
"Why do we fight?" he asked. "I swear, human, your blindness is sometimes baffling."
"You're a heartless murderer," Hairn said, staggering to his feet. "Why would I let you live?" Graven chuckled at that.
"I live regardless of what you do. Don't you see how alike you and I are? Look around. Can't you see what I've accomplished?"
Fires burned across the city. Guards patrolled the area surrounding Ingram's mansion, and Elisa hung at the docks waiting for Zusa to rescue her. Yes, Hairn thought, he could see it just fine. "Nothing," he said. "You and I are nothing alike."
"Try opening your eyes then, and perhaps you'll see differently."
Hairn stepped to the side, feinted a thrust, and then came rushing in, his sabers slashing with all his strength. "What could you know of me?" he cried as his sabers whirled and cut, flooding the rooftop with the sound of steel on steel as Graven blocked each one with a deft twist of his blade. Growing desperate, Hearn tried a complicated series of short thrusts he'd learned from one of his many trainers. The idea was to overwhelm his opponents with attacks so that when one finally slipped through, Hearn could step in and put all his force behind it. But Graven was no normal opponent, and he retreated step by step to each thrust, parrying only when Hearn tried to press in. When Hearn at last could not keep it up, he tried to pull back, and that's when Graven struck. Hearn flung his sabers up in defense as the elf charged in, but he left himself vulnerable to one side, and in slipped Graven's foot, tripping him. He hit the ground with a thud, the blow knocking the wind out of him. Again he expected a killing blow, but Graven retreated, twirling his sword as if he were bored. "I know so much about you, Hearn," he said. "I know the role you played against the guilds and the trifect. When rumors of that pathetic little war's end reached my ears, all blamed on the actions of one man, I scoffed. But the truce lasted, so in disguise I came to Veldaren. Piece by piece, story by story, I learned what you did. I listened to the way the scum of the city spoke your name. You were a beacon of hope to me in this dying world. My race is outnumbered, and every day it dwindles while the race of man spreads like an unstoppable plague. But your cities, your true places of power, were your weakness. If I could bring them toppling down, we might survive. And there you were, one man, with an entire city in your grip. And then there was Angelport, reaching to our forests with its bloody fingers. Within every faction, even my own, I slaughtered those who desired peace, who would rather make deals and concessions than face the true ugliness and conflict that must be fought if we are to endure another century. When I first used your bloody eye, I did so as an homage, not a calling. Imagine my delight when you actually arrived. I thought you could help me, that you would see the need for this. Angelport is worse than Veldaren ever was. There is no salvation in it, no desire for peace, no hope for something better. There is greed and hatred and nothing else." Hearn took to his feet, and Graven attacked him with such viciousness he had to retreat. The long blade sliced through the air, always a half-second behind. "You tamed the vile darkness in Veldaren," the elf said as he chased. "You killed hundreds to force a final confrontation and subdue the guilty. Help me do the same here. Everything I've done has been to force the war needed to bring everything into focus, to give clarity to the nations. My kind will burn this city to the ground, a glorious purification that all Desrel, both elf and man, so desperately needs." "I am not you," Hearn cried, attempting a counter that was quickly blocked. "I will not murder the innocent." "You murder innocents with your actions, you damn fool. You've left children to starve, wives without protection, guilds so weak others tore them to pieces. Celestia, help me, how are you so naive?" Hearn tried to shut him out, to ignore the words that echoed his own thoughts, awakening guilt he'd carried for years but done his best to deny. Graven could see his torment, and he fought closer, forcing an opening in his saber so he might slash a shallow cut across Hearn's chest. As Hearn stumbled back, blood dripping down his shirt, Graven shook the droplets from his sword. "We are alike, Watcher. I am your mirror, your shadow, the natural progression to what you began. Do not throw your life away without reason. Look what we have done by ourselves, through manipulation and sheer brute strength. Imagine what we could do together! We can thrust the darkness of mankind into the light. We can find the vile corners in which the sickness hides and burn it all to the ground. Help me! Fight beside me! We have the same goals, the same methods. Do you not see?" "Our methods might be the same," Hearn said, mustering the last of his strength. "But I never wanted to destroy Veldaren, only save it. I won't be the monster you want me to be." Graven shook his head. Then to Valderin I will go next. I'll finish what you started. I'll hunt down everyone you knew, everyone you loved. No one betrays me, Watcher. Whatever legacy you had, I'll destroy it and replace it with my own." Hairn felt time slowing as he settled once more into a stance. He thought of the wraith running loose in Valderin, slaughtering priests, thieves, mercenaries, all to bring about chaos and riots. He thought of every step of his life made worthless, the brittle peace breaking into a slaughter worse than it had ever been before. He thought of Tarlac and Brugh trying to fight it, only to be overwhelmed. Most of all, he thought of Delicia, dying at the hands of the wraith. "No," he said, shifting his weight onto his back leg. "You won't." "Help me, Asher," he prayed as Graven twirled his sword. "Not for me, but for them." The elf leaped, and Hairn met the charge. They crashed together in the air, a brutal collision of kicks and slashes. The sword cut a wound across his thigh, the pain terrible. His heel caught Graven's jaw, and a saber slashed across his knuckles. They landed with their backs to each other. Graven swung behind him, twisting his body while keeping his feet planted. Hairn arched backward, the edge slicing the air above his chest. Returning to a stand, he thrust both his blades, but the elf looped his arm around, smacking them away. Now, face to face, they dueled once more, Hairn driven on by a fury approaching madness. He kept on the attack, spinning and thrusting with such precision he couldn't help think his father would be proud. All his inhibitions, all his doubt, faded away as his sabers sang out a song of violence. He'd once thought himself a monster, but now he faced a true monster, a being sworn to death and destruction, to whom life was only to be taken, not preserved. Whatever limits he knew, he pushed beyond them, despite the pain of his cuts, the ache of his muscles, and the blood that poured across his cloaks. But Graven would not fall, and at last Hairn knew his energy was almost at an end. He had but one final trick, the cloak dance he'd relied on for years. Graven had defeated it before, but Hairn trusted it, knew how he might react when facing him a second time. Pulling back, he weaved himself into a spin, his cloak separating and flailing in a bizarre pattern to hide his weapons and the positioning of his hands and feet. As Hairn's vision was momentarily blocked, up came the expected smoke. Graven had been shifting left just before vanishing, and denying every instinct, every piece of information he'd seen otherwise from the elf's stance, eyes, and momentum. Hairn turned and thrust his sabers blindly to the right. Graven's sword slashed across his arm, spilling blood but failing to achieve the lethal hit he desired. His eyes grew wide, and his momentum carried him all the way into Hairn's arms as if in an embrace. His mouth opened, his lips trembling. With a twist of his wrists, Hairn pulled his sabers free from deep in Graven's belly. The elf fell on his back in a clang of metal and rustle of cloth. Hairn stood over him, watching, his sabers dripping blood. "Killing me stops nothing," Graven said, coughing. Blood spilled across his lips. "Your war, your hatred, it's a disease that will destroy you, a flame that will consume you. Even without me, you humans will destroy one another." "I know." "Then why this, Watcher? Why stop me?" Hairn knelt over Graven, and he made sure the elf could see the fire in his eyes. "Because I must. I will fight it until my dying breath. I will fight our failures, our weakness, our destruction. Whether I succeed or not, I will never sit by and watch our world burn. There is good in us, even if you cannot see it. Somehow I'll find a way to save it." Graven rolled onto his stomach, and he crawled toward where Diradan knelt on one knee, having watched the entire encounter. "They will consume us," the elf said, his voice growing weak. just as they consume themselves. But must we die with them? Diradon shook his head.
Never your place, Craven. Die now, and may Celestia grant you the mercy I cannot give.
Hearn put his saber against the elf's back, its tip aimed for the heart. Farewell, he said, thrusting. Graven gasped, his hands twitched, and then he lay still. Diradon slowly rose to his feet, careful to put as little weight on his wounded leg as possible. Meanwhile, Hearn took a saber to his own cloak and cut off his hood. Tossing the cloth aside, he removed Graven's hood and held it in his hands. Flecks of blood stained it, but they were well hidden by the dark material. Taking a deep breath, he pulled it over his head. Shadows immediately covered his face, and when he spoke, his voice changed, a subtle magic weaving over his words. "It's finished," he said. Diradon frowned at him.
"You would honor him in his death?"
he asked, gesturing to the hood. Hearn shook his head. "No honor, and not for him," he said. "Remembrance, so I might never forget."
"And what is that?"
He glanced at Graven's corpse. "We're men, not gods, regardless of how many lives we take. Can you run?" Diradon shook his head.
"Go on without me. Find your friends at the docks. I'll not be far behind."
"I'll be waiting." No running, no leaping from rooftops. Hearn carefully climbed down from the roof, put his feet on solid ground, and limped toward the docks. Chapter 26. Dawn was fast approaching, but that only meant the night was at its darkest as Hearn slowly approached the docks. Even from afar, he saw a sight that made his heart ache. Clenching his teeth, he tried to hope for the best. "No," he whispered. "Please, Asher. No. It can't end like this. It can't be this way." Yet Zeus's body lay so very still. Holding his cloaks tighter, for he suddenly felt terribly cold, he kept walking. Elisa was nowhere in sight. Even the many docked boats appeared empty. Hearn could imagine where they'd gone. To Ingram's, most likely. Let them fight over the city, he thought. Far as he was concerned, they could have it. At Zeus's body, he knelt and put his hand against her neck. He held his breath and closed his eyes, not wanting to see the bloody wound across her stomach, not wanting to think about who had done it. There was a pulse. "Thank you," he whispered. Tearing at his cloak, he stuffed the cleanest parts he could find against the wound to stem the soft blood flow. After that, he tied it, careful when he lifted her. She grunted at the movement, and he saw her open her eyes. With tender care, he removed the wrappings from her face so he could see her better. A moment later, her eyes came into focus, and she looked his way. Despite her obvious pain, a hint of a smile crossed her lips. You would," she said, her voice hoarse. "Shush," he told her, focusing on bandaging the wound. "Lie still until I can look at this better. Can't believe you're even alive." He heard the sound of soft footsteps on the wood, and he glanced back to see Diradon approaching. He'd wrapped his wounded leg and somewhere had found a long stick of wood to use as a crutch.
"Where is Lady Gemcroft?"
the elf asked, glancing about the empty dock. "They took her," Zusa said, having to swallow repeatedly so her voice would not crack. "Who?" Hearn asked. "Merchants. They're giving her to the elves." Diradon shook his head and muttered a few words in Elvish.
"I can save her if I act quickly. Can you escape the city on your own?"
"We'll need to heal her first," said Hearn. "Give me an hour or so, and I think I can get us out." The elf nodded.
"I cannot be seen in here come daylight," he said. "I don't think the guards would take too kindly to my presence."
Hearn chuckled. "Where shall we find you, then?"
"I'll find you," Dioradon said. "That's what I'm best at. Just stay on the roads, and good luck, Watcher."
He hurried away, moving at a remarkable pace for having to use a crutch. Hearn watched him go, then turned back to Zusa. Her dark skin was growing pale, and he knew time was short. "Should be used to this by now," he muttered as he took her into his arms. "Still, don't like it," she said, and despite the chaos of the night, he laughed. Step by step, he told himself as he took her down the quiet street. Step by step. At the entrance to the temple, he tried the door and found it locked. Beating on it with his fists, he waited, leaning beside the door to help support both his weight and Zusa's. When he was met with only silence, he tried again. Then a third time, refusing to be turned away. At last the door cracked open, first only a little, then wide, as Noel realized who was there. "We had nowhere else to go," Hearn told him. "She needs healing, and quickly. Will you help us?" Noel chewed on his lower lip. "You would trust me?" he asked. "As I said, I have little choice." The priest nodded. "Bring her in." Hearn carried her into the empty temple. "I sent Logan home when the fires started," said the priest as he gestured to the nearest bench. "Thought it best he be with his family should something happen. This city grows worse with every day. What happened to Zusa?" "She was cut by a blade," Hearn said, stepping away so he could lean against a wall. His breathing had grown short, and carrying Zusa had sapped what little strength he had left. Noel looked over the wound, a deep frown across his face. "I'm not sure I can heal this," he said. "You better damn well try." "You don't understand. My faith the past few years has been weak. I fear this is beyond me. Asher may not hear my prayers." Hearn took a step toward him, then suddenly lunged and grabbed the priest by the front of his robe, yanking him close so they could speak face to face. "I don't care," he said. "You hear me? I don't care what you did, that you betrayed me or how badly you failed before. You kneel there, and you heal her. Don't give Asher a choice to hear you, understand?" Noel nodded, and he looked visibly relieved when Hearn let him go. Turning back to Zusa, the priest knelt, his hands on her wounds. He bowed his head and began to pray. Too scared to watch, Hearn closed his eyes and waited. And hoped. At last the prayers ceased. Still hesitant to look, he waited, head low, until he felt a hand touch his face. Opening his eyes, he saw Zusa standing there, her bloody bandages still on the bench, her revealed skin scarred, but healed. Noel sat beside her, bewildered and in tears. "Thank you," she said to both of them, gently resting her head against Hearn's chest as her arms wrapped about him. "Just thank you." "We have little time," he said. "Are you ready to go?" She nodded. Hearn put his hand on Noel's shoulder, squeezed it, and then left him kneeling there on the floor as they slowly limped out of the temple and toward the city's walls. Lord Edgar and newly named Lord Warwick were in the mansion discussing their future plans for the city when the servant knocked at the door. "Yes?" Warwick asked. The servant came in and bowed low, looking incredibly nervous. He'd been one of many originally staffed by Ingram, and it seemed every single one from top to bottom thought they were a heartbeat away from being executed should they show a lack of skill at their position. "My lord, we received word from the messenger you sent to the elves." "Already?" asked Edgar, "but it's hardly been an hour." "I know," said the servant, licking his lips. "Your messenger said an elf was waiting outside the city as if expecting him. The elf said he'll accept your, gift." Edgar shrugged. "Not entirely surprising." Shall I fetch her?
No, Warwick said. I must be the one to do this. It only feels just. You.
Jarl, said the servant.
Good, Jarl. Go tell this elf that we will be bringing Elisa to him, if he will kindly wait for us.
The servant bowed low, then hurried away. Warwick promised Edgar he'd return soon, then ventured out into the mansion grounds. They'd cleaned away most of the bodies, but the blood still remained. The grass would grow strong next spring, he thought, feeling a bit of grim amusement. The understaffed servants hurried about, trying to put everything back in order as if the battle had never happened. They'd never succeed, of course. Warwick was in charge now. Things would never be as they were, and the city would be all the better for it. At the entrance to the dungeon, the city guards bowed low, both men looking uncomfortable. Warwick knew Ingram was hardly loved among the city folk, but compared to him, Warwick was an unknown, a frightening entity suddenly come to power. He'd overlook their stuttered words and shifting eyes for a little while. At some point, though, he'd have to either win them over or terrify them into submission.
Go fetch me Elisa, he told them. Make sure she remains unharmed.
The first guard bowed low and then hurried inside. As Warwick waited, he called over another of his guards and requested an escort. He would not travel through the city without the support of shields and blades, not with fires and riots fresh in his memory. Granted, he'd caused most of them, but that was irrelevant. When the guard returned with Elisa, Warwick bowed as low as his old spine allowed.
I hope your stay has been pleasant, he said.
Elisa's face and dress were covered with dirt, and she sported fresh bruises from the previous night's entertainment at the docks. At his words, she smiled so sweetly, as if he'd brought her down from Veldaren for tea.
A most exquisite locale, she said. I hope you get a chance to sample its pleasures.
Warwick chuckled.
One day, perhaps, but I fear I'll be dead before I spend any time in those cells.
We can only hope.
Save some of your charm for the elves. You'll need it to keep your head.
He nodded to his guards, and with Elisa still in chains, they left the compound and headed for the gates of the city. As they walked, Warwick took in the sights with a fresh set of eyes. No longer were the various stores just his partners in trade, or the taverns places his underlings could fritter away their coin. They were his now, his protection, his servants. They would pay taxes to him, kneel at his feet, and show respect far beyond what he'd known as a low-born man sailing the seas in search of wealth. Even the people seemed different, for they were his people now. Of course, the other merchant lords would have their say in things, and each would obtain parcels of land in the surrounding areas. The Remir was theirs now, after all. At the gates, the soldiers saluted and gave way.
"Where is the elf?"
Warwick asked as they paused a moment underneath a stone arch of the gateway.
"If your eyes are sharp, you can see him from here," said the guard, pointing to a far hill.
Warwick shook his head, able to see only a blur, but he knew his eyes were not the same eyes of his youth, when he'd sat in the crow's nest calling out banners of distant ships. He could see hills easily enough, though, and he and his escort headed out. The minutes passed, the only sound the clatter of his guard's armor and the clinking of Elisa's chains. As they neared, Warwick saw the elf but failed to recognize him.
"Hail, elf of Quelazar," he called out.
"Hail, Lord of Angelport,"
the elf returned. Warwick smiled. At least he was polite enough. They closed the distance, and he took a better look at him. The elf had long brown hair carefully braided so it would not interfere with his vision. His eyes sparkled as he bowed low, refusing to move from his spot atop the hill.
"I must apologize for all our misunderstandings,"
Warwick said, offering a half-bow.
"But I am Lord of Angelport now and must try to make amends. I believe your people have been demanding Lady Elisa for trial, and I have come offering her as a gift to start a new friendship between us."
The elf nodded, his face somber.
"I accept, and will bring her to Quelazar, where she may have a trial. Release her from her chains."
Warwick raised an eyebrow.
Would it not be better to keep her bound until she reaches your forests?
Do not insult me. I am not alone, and she cannot escape from us, not in the wilds.
Of course, Warwick said, bowing again. He looked to his guards. Release her. They unclamped the chains from her wrists and ankles. Elisa absently rubbed the raw flesh as she took a hesitant step toward the elf. Warwick felt glad to be rid of her. After everything, he had little doubt to her fate. Once the elves took her head, the trifecta would crumble, nearly every strong leader among them broken. After that, he and his comrades would spread north to pick up the pieces.
"Farewell,"
the elf said, and he bowed deeply. He did not leave, though, only stood there with Elisa at his side as if waiting for Warwick. Warwick wondered if it was a custom he was unaware of and resolved to learn more about the elves since his dealings with them would be of the utmost importance over the next few years. With Elisa gone, he felt a great weight off his shoulders, and when he re-entered Angelport, it was with a smile on his face. Elisa waited beside the elf until Warwick and his escort were far out of sight before stepping away from him and crossing her arms over her chest. "I have refused elven justice once already," she said. "Who am I to go to now? Will Larissa hang me in secret, or do we head to Quelazar for a sham of a trial?" The elf turned to her, and she noticed he did so with a poorly concealed limp.
"Not exactly,"
he said, and a smile crossed his face as he put his fingers to his lips and whistled. At the bottom of the hill, hidden from sight of Angelport, was a heavy gathering of brush, and from its center, Herne and Zusa stood up from their hiding place. Relief flooded through her, the sight of Zusa alive and well sending her to tears. She ran down the hill at a breakneck pace, and when she reached Zusa, she flung herself against her. "Careful," Zusa said, pulling back. "My wounds are still tender." Elisa laughed, then brought her attention to Herne, who she hugged and kissed his cheek. "Thank you, both of you," she said. The elf joined them, and Herne bowed his head respectfully. "We cannot thank you enough, Dieradon," he said.
"I should be thanking you," said the elf. "Ceradon will not enjoy hearing it, but he must learn of Larissa's misconduct, as well as Graven's manipulation of these events. I feel tensions between our races will never vanish, but at least this might pull us back from war for a time."
Dieradon retrieved a cane he'd placed by the brush, saluted them all, and then started walking toward Quelazar. Elisa watched him go for a moment, then called out his name. "I never attacked Larissa," she told him when he glanced back. "But I know who did. It was Torgar, a mercenary who now rules the Keenan household. He confessed as much to me when he still thought I would die." Dieradon froze, and the look in his eyes was chilling. Without a word, he continued on. Feeling a little better, Elisa began heading north with Zusa toward home. To her surprise, Herne did not follow, instead climbing the hill toward Angelport. "Where are you going?" she asked him. He glanced back, and his gaze was disturbingly hollow. "How can we leave like this?" he asked. "Walking home beaten, bloodied, having failed so terribly." Elisa thought of setting foot in Angelport, and her revulsion was overwhelming. "No," she said. "Leave them be. There's nothing left for us there. Not any more." "I disagree." Herne ran back toward the city's walls, and Elisa felt her heart ache at the sight. "What is he hoping to accomplish?" she asked. "We'll give him a night," Zusa said, watching him go. "Dieradon gave me enough coin to buy food and passage back to Velderen, so we do not need to hurry. Let him find what he needs. He'll return to us, though. I know it." Elisa clutched Zusa's hand, and they embraced once more. "Never do that to me again," she said. "I'll try." They walked north, gaining enough distance from Angelport to feel comfortable, then set up camp off the road to wait out the night and give the watcher his chance to come back.
Chapter 27. Despite the severe lack of the many comforts still to be relocated from his old home, Warwick stayed the night at Ingram's mansion. His mansion, he tried to remind himself as he changed into a thick bedrobe. It'd take several weeks before he stopped thinking of it as Ingram's, but he had to try. He was an old man, and change was not something he was well accustomed to. The bed was absurdly large, with curtains across the bedposts. At least it'd be warm in winter, thought Warwick as he washed his face and hands in a basin of cool water. As he dried his hands on a wool cloth, he heard a soft creak, faint enough he might have imagined it. When he looked back, he knew it was no trick of his ears. A man knelt by the window, swords drawn. He recognized that shadowed face, though he lacked his characteristic smile.
"What is it you come for, Wraith?" Warwick asked, trying not to sound afraid.
"The Wraith is dead," said the intruder, shaking his head. Warwick frowned, and he took a step closer. He knew if the man was skilled enough to make it past his guards, ascend the walls, and sneak in through his window, there was little chance he could escape now. He might as well see if he could learn something first.
"If not him," Warwick said, thinking aloud, "then... are you Veldarin's watcher?"
"I am," said the man. His voice was a cold whisper, the harsh edge to it enough to convince Warwick what his plans were. His throat suddenly dry, Warwick tried to remain calm. He was an old man and not afraid of death. It was just losing everything he'd accomplished, all on the night of his greatest triumph, that struck him most. Only a cruel world would allow something like that.
"Why are you here, Watcher?" he asked. "Have you come to kill me?"
"The thought has crossed my mind."
"And why is that? I have never met you before and have committed no crime against you. Surely we can talk reason. Unless you've been paid, and even then I might offer you a more advantageous sum."
The Watcher chuckled, as if amused, but there was no amusement in the whites of his eyes that shone out from the hood. "You sold Elisa out for death. Why should you live?" Warwick sighed.
"Is that really it? Elves came into this city as if our walls meant nothing. Do you think Angelport can endure a second night like that? Of course I gave her over. If they want to hang her, I won't shed a tear, but I don't care if they send her back to Veldarin with only a paddling. The Trifect is a dying beast, with or without Elisa's help."
The Watcher shook his head. "You are a plague upon Desrel. Locusts who will consume and not build. I cannot let you remain rulers of the Remir."
"Wait!" Warwick said, his anger overriding his panic. "Who has told you that? Who has judged us so? You've come a long way to hear, Watcher. Who whispered that judgment against us in your ear? Elisa? Laurie before he died? The Trifect dares claim we only reap, not sow? Who are they to speak of such things, when they have held kings in their pockets and broken down anyone who might oppose them? They are hardly innocent, Watcher, no more so than we. Ingram was a fool and a coward. He would have led Angelport to war against the elves one day, regardless of our interference. His guards were corrupt, his justice short-sighted and brutal. How many men did he hang in your name, Watcher? Yet you come bearing swords against me?
What of the Violet? I've seen what it can do. It's a danger, and you've nearly caused a war in your desire to claim it. Warwick sat down atop his bed, observing how each step he took made the Watcher tense.
"I will admit, it would have been a wonderful weapon to wield against the Trifect," he said, deciding there was no reason to attempt lying to the strange man. "With it, we might have thoroughly destroyed the last significant remains of the Keenan's trading empire, for even a few months of disruption would have carried permanent damage. But the Violet cannot grow beyond the Elves' forest, and you were in Angelport last night. You saw what just a few of those elves did, slaughtering hundreds. And that was with Ingram's soldiers prepared for the attack. Trust me when I say our hope for obtaining significant trade for the violet has faded.
That doesn't mean you won't risk war again if you feel you have a chance to obtain the leaf again.
Warwick shook his head. So stubborn in your thinking. I want peace now, perhaps even more than Ingram ever wanted it. We're merchants, not knights and kings. So long as I can keep the coin flowing, I will remain happy. Angelport is ours. The lands and titles always denied to us will finally flow. We will compete with the trifect, and we will slowly destroy it, only now on even terms. War? I am too old for a war. The threat was what we needed, a looming crisis to make people panic and give up what they might not otherwise. But now I have a city to run, and all the lands of the Remir soon to be sworn into my care, assuming our glorious king isn't as dumb as his reputation claims. What do I now care for a simple weed? Why would I desire a war that would burn all my hard-won rewards to the ground?
The Watcher had nothing to say to that, and Warwick laughed at the utter stupidity of it all.
You came here knowing little, Watcher, only what you have heard. People lie. People exaggerate. They view the world through tainted glass, yet see themselves in a gilded mirror. Did you think you could come into this city like some dark reaper and bring us justice? You cannot fix all of Desrel, and I dare say it isn't your damn place to do so either. You were a fool if you thought otherwise. Now kill me if you still think yourself justified in doing so. Watch Angelport descend into anarchy as the remaining merchant lords squabble among themselves for rule, and Lord Edgar tries to retake it for himself when he realizes he won't receive his promised rewards. Watch as the minor nobles at the edges of the Remir form alliances out of fear, then come here to conquer. Take your blind justice and watch thousands suffer for it. Either that, or leave me to run my damn city.
The Watcher stood, not quite as tall as when he'd entered. His sabers slid into their scabbards.
You truly believe you can rule this city? Lead it to peace? He asked. Far better than that paranoid fool Ingram, yes.
Then I leave for Veldarin. No, I will keep my eyes south, and my ears will always be listening. Should you or any other lord of the Remir begin pressing the elven borders for the violet,
your threats are unnecessary, Warwick said.
Not quite, said the Watcher. He lifted a rolled scroll with Warwick's own seal pushed into the fresh wax. A scroll that should still have been in his dresser. Slowly, strip by strip, the man tore it into dozens of pieces. Consider the treaty you tortured out of Lady Gemcroft to have never existed, Warwick. Alisa goes not to the elves either, but home. If you cherish your life, you won't dare try such a scheme again.
Very well, said Warwick. Amusing as it might have been, that scroll isn't necessary. As I said, the trifect is a wounded animal even with Alisa's survival. It won't need our help to die. Go on home. No one will miss you here.
The cloaked man leaped out the window onto the rooftop and into the night. Warwick let out a sigh of relief, then vowed to have the damn window boarded up first thing in the morning. Hearn saw the fire as he traveled north, yet almost did not go to it. He didn't think it could be them, not with how close it was to the city. If they'd walked a steady pace north, they should have been several miles beyond. Still, he went, and sure enough saw Alisa and Zusa lying side by side, with only each other and the fire to keep warm amid the cold night. Hearn took a seat beside it, tossing on a few branches to bring it roaring back to life. On the other side, Zusa stirred, and she sat up alert, as if she had not even been sleeping.
"Oh," Zusa said, seeing him there.
Hearn pulled the hood off his head and tossed it to the dirt beside him. "Why did you wait for me?" he asked after a moment of uncomfortable silence. To that, Zusa laughed. "Go to sleep, Watcher," she said. And try not to ask foolish questions." The casual dismissal put his mind at ease, and spreading out his cloaks as a blanket, he slept beside the roaring fire. Epilogue.
"I really have no choice in this?" Torgar asked the eldest of his newly appointed advisers, a spindly man named Yates or Bates or something like that. Already he felt his mind fraying with the bewildering amounts of names and people and places he was suddenly expected to remember. They stood in the den of the Keenan mansion, him before the fire, the adviser beside a large stack of books he'd been writing in most of the day.
"Given the precarious position our house is in," the man said, shifting from foot to foot as if he had no choice but to fidget, "I feel it best you meet with him quickly. If you could make peace with the merchants now, it'd mean a great deal for—"
"So your answer is yes?" Torgar asked, glaring at him. "Fine, get out. I know where I'm going, and I sure as shit don't need a chaperone."
Once the old man was gone, Torgar went to his room, retrieved his sword. He glanced at his armor, rolled his eyes. He felt exhausted enough as is. Going through the tiresome process of putting it on didn't feel worth it. So he slung his sword across his back and made a quick stop in Tori's room.
"She still eating well?"
he asked Lily, who held the baby in her arms.
"Crying more than eating,"
Lily said, pulling up at her dress to hide her exposed breast.
"I think she's growing a tooth."
Torgar ran a hand through the scattered fuzz that was Tori's hair, and when she looked up at him, he laughed.
"Stupid kid," he said. "Just eat, will you?"
He left Lily to handle the babe as she resumed crying, heading out the main doors and to the gate beyond. Slamming the gate behind him was immensely satisfying, for it made him think he might be free of his responsibilities, if only for a brief while. Keeping things sane seemed far harder than it had for Laurie or even Madeline. So many people wanting things, making offers, calling up debts. No matter how much wealth Torgar's new advisers insisted they had, it never seemed enough.
"Damn shame Madeline killed you,"
Torgar murmured, imagining a ghostly Laurie walking beside him.
"Should be you doing this, not me."
Down the dark street he walked. The sky was heavily clouded, and the sun soon to set. Still, it put his mind at ease. Quiet streets amid open air. Even a bit of rain wouldn't put a damper on his mood, so long as a bolt of lightning didn't also come to say hello. Once he neared the docks, he started paying more attention to where he went, until at last he found the Port and Loan building unguarded, its door unlocked. Stepping inside, Torgar passed through the slender entryway and into the large oval room beyond. It was dimly lit with a few candles set atop the table, and sitting alone in one of the chairs was Stern Blackwater. The man rose to his feet at Torgar's entrance, though he stayed where he was and did not offer his hand in greeting.
"It has taken far too long for you to agree to such a meeting," Stern said. "Grumble all you want,"
Torgar said, pulling his sword and sheath off his back and setting it atop the table. The metal rattled on the dark wood.
"But I have things to do, as you can imagine."
"I can," Stern said,
"but I am Tori's grandfather. Keeping me from her is disrespectful and against what you told me earlier."
Torgar pulled out a chair at the table and plopped down into it. Something about sitting at the table exclusively reserved for the merchant lords amused him, and he propped up his dirty boots on the table as well. His heels kicked the handle of his sword, spun it a few degrees.
"Well, I'm here now," Torgar said. "What is so terribly important that we must speak in the dark of night?"
From outside, the first echo of distant thunder breached the walls, followed by the howl of the warm southern winds.
"I don't know how you conned Madeline," Stern said, "but we both know you're in over your head. Never stopped me before. But it needs to stop now. Hand Tori over to me. Give up your status as her protector and let me be the one to safeguard her wealth. I'll do a far better job than you."
Torgar let out a snort.
"I thought you might try something like this," he said, "but you see, I have a big sword, and you're an annoying, soft-handed merchant. You can't intimidate me, and you won't convince me otherwise. Everything of Laurie's and Madeline's is mine, and even if I need to hire a dozen advisers to tell me what scroll to put my X on, I'll do it. Tori ain't yours, Her money ain't yours, and if you try something like this again, I'll make sure you won't speak a word to her until her 16th birthday. Have I made myself clear?"
Stern glanced at the sword on the table, at Torgar's wide grin. "Perfectly clear," he said. "Now is my time to make myself clear. That document you have is nothing, a scrap of paper with a dead woman's signature. Such a thing may carry more weight here in Angelport than elsewhere, but I've learned a thing or two from our guests from Valderin." A deeper rumble sounded from outside, the heavy storm rolling in from the ocean. The door to the room swung inward, and in stepped an elf, his face painted in camouflage, his clothes a mixture of greens and browns. In his hand he held an enormous bow. An arrow was pressed against the string, but not yet pulled taut.
"Greetings, Torgar,"
said the elf as the building shook from thunder.
"What do you want?" Torgar asked, trying to sound more annoyed than afraid.
"You should know. I spoke with Elisa, and she had a very interesting story to tell me about a boast Stern confirmed overhearing."
Torgar's sword was still on the table, the handle beside the heel of his boot. He had no chance of reaching it in time.
"Aw, fuck me," he said as the arrow flew.
Hairn sat atop the hill, staring at the lights of Valderin in the distance. The wraith's old hood lay in his lap, and beside him on the grass were his sabers. He held his chin in his hand, his elbow resting on his knee. He more heard than saw Delicia's approach. With a soft rustle of her robes, which shone silver in the starlight, she sat beside him. Her arm slid about him, and he felt her head rest against his shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked. "You've been morose ever since returning, and I don't think you've gone out at night once to patrol." Hairn started to say something defensive, but fought it down. Instead, he leaned against her, and he closed his eyes as he forced himself to relax. "Back at Angelport, I met a man who I might have become. A man who thought the city was his, who felt he could control every faction by a twist of his blade. Deep down, he truly believed he was justified in doing what he did. He was protecting those he loved, his friends and family back in Quelizar. And so he killed and reveled in his hatred for the men he viewed guilty. And now I come here, where I've killed to establish control, where I've murdered and punished all to protect my own friends, my own family." He waved a hand toward the lights of Valderin. "I started thinking of Valderin as my city. But those thoughts don't belong to me. They belong to someone like the Wraith, someone like my father. Have I truly become anything better? By my hands, even innocent people die. And it's all because of my own anger, my own hatred toward the thief guilds." "Do you really think that?" Delicia asked. Hairn shook his head. "I don't know." He felt her lips press against his cheek, and it seemed time slowed. "You never really hated the guilds, Hairn. I know you better than that. You never fought against them. You never fought to destroy the Trifect. You wanted to save Valderin from the world you escaped from. You wanted people to live without fear. It was never for you. So long as you remember that, I trust you. Go do what must be done, and we'll be here when you need us." Hairn wrapped his arms about her, kissed her lips, and then held her tight as he felt his body shiver. His guilt drained away, and he clutched her as a man might hold a piece of driftwood in a storm. "Always be there for me," he whispered. "If you're there, if you're able to forgive me, I can continue to go on. I'll know I'm still me, still something worthwhile to save." She kissed him again, then handed him his hood. He put it on, and as the shadows enveloped his face, he grabbed his sabers and hooked them to his belt. Waving goodbye, he ran to Valderin, to the many secret ways over the walls and into the dens of thieves and nobles. There was comfort in those shadows, a freedom as he leaped from the wall to the roof of the nearest house. He'd stalk the night and let his determination fuel the fear he bestowed upon those who turned their blades against the innocent. The slaughters of the past, the riots, the betrayals. They'd not happen, not here, not again. Not while he watched. Warwick was right. He couldn't save all of Desrel. But Veldaren was his home, the place of his father, the city of his friends. Along the rooftops ran the Watcher, cloaks trailing, sabers in hand. A note from the author. This might amuse some of you. When I first created the storyline to this book a long while back, the ending was, well, significantly different. Instead of Deirdre intercepting Elisa on the way to the elves and then releasing her, she was kept in Warwick's prison. The elves were to demand her execution still, despite everything, and Warwick would do it as a way of ensuring peace as well as getting rid of her. That execution was going to be successful. I meant to have Herne and Zusa watching, and then, despite Herne's attempts to stop her, Zusa lunging onto the platform to free her, only to die as dozens of arrows shot her down. Herne was to slink away back to Veldaren, alone, thoroughly defeated. I don't know why I was so determined to have this book end so drearily. At the time, Shadow Dance was only to be a trilogy, and I think I fell for this belief that for the book to feel nice and final, it had to be dark and brutal and depressing. Because that's how you end a proper trilogy, right? Heck, the original name of the book was A Dance of Death, a title I hated less than a month after publishing. In addition to all this, having Zusa and Elisa die helped explain why they weren't in my later half-orc novels. All dead, nice and easy explanation. However, I told a good friend of mine, Rob Duperret, the overall plotline. His reaction paraphrased? That'd be awesome, but you know you can't. What? Why not? Is that really how you want Elisa's story to end? Seems kind of pointless, really, and depressing. And it was. I looked back and realized I had her come to power over the death of her father, had her son kidnapped and brutalized, had her suitor try to kill her, and then when she comes to Angelport, she ends up getting executed in a ploy to prevent a war, and her best friend, Zusa, dies at her feet. So perhaps that did happen in an alternate timeline of Desrel, but for me, I couldn't do it. Didn't feel right, didn't feel appropriate. They both deserved better, and more important, I didn't want to sacrifice the ability to tell more stories with either of them. I've made that mistake before, and I didn't want to make it again. Of course, some of you may be sitting here thinking, that'd have been epic. Maybe you're right. And if you disagree, well, then it's all Rob's stupid idea. Anyway, even despite taking the ending down a notch in terms of depression and suckiness, my original version, the pre-Orbit edition if you will, still had a downer of an ending. Angelport had defeated Herne, leaving him feeling beaten and confused. And coming back to the book with fresh eyes, I really couldn't tell why I did even that. More of my determination to have some sort of foreboding heaviness, I guess. Herne recounted a summary of the events at the end, and reading it, I wondered what book he'd been involved in, because it wasn't the one I wrote. So the ending I have now rewritten rather heavily. It's not sunshine and rainbows, but it's not the crushing loss I first tried to make it out to be. Herne still faced a mirror of himself, saw what he could become, but he also defeated it. And Delicia's still there, ready to help him pick up the pieces. Speaking of Delicia, when I first ended the story here, I had plenty of people pissed off at me, wondering what happened with Zusa and Delicia, how their relationship with Herne worked, etc. Well, when I started what is now Shadow Dance number 4, I swore to elaborate on that relationship. I also dropped the ball in the original version of that. But hey, that's what this whole process with Orbit has been for me. This one shot to get everything down, get it right, get the editorial oversight I truly need. because I'm lazy and willing to let crap go if I think I can get away with it. Thankfully, Devi, editor lady, doesn't let me get away with anything. Except maybe these notes from the author. I have full power here. Bwahahaha. That's right. Stereotypical evil laugh. Anyway, I used to feel this book was the best of the initial three, but over time I realized Dance of Blades was the one best put together and most consistent in terms of tone and plot. However, now that I've gotten to tear into Dance of Mirrors, get all these threads nailed down, the ending reworked, the various players far better clarified, I think this might be my favorite of them again. Graven, in particular, was a blast to write, especially once he was revealed as the Wraith and could make his appeals to both Herne and Diradan. With only a few tweaks, I could have made him a hero. And really, that was the whole dang point. Oh, and lastly, if you're wondering where the heck Thren Fellhorn went, I promise he's right back to prominence in Book 4. I haven't forgotten him. In fact, he's going to be around more than ever, and if there's anything I love, it's that crazy, ruthless bastard. Quick thanks to those who deserve it. Devi, who I think I've finally convinced I am capable of learning. Rob, for all the advice. Michael, for dealing with all the headaches involving contracts and deadlines so I don't have to. And Sam, for raising our two beautiful daughters and dealing with that headache while I'm off in the library writing. And of course, you, dear reader. I hope I've given you characters that you enjoy, that you might remember, that remind you why you read fantasy fiction in the first place. If I can pull that off, then hopefully you'll get to read many, many more rambling notes like this from me in the future. David Dalglish, April 18th, 2013. Continue listening for an excerpt from A Dance of Shadows by David Dalglish. Introducing. If you enjoyed A Dance of Mirrors, look out for A Dance of Shadows, Shadow Dance Book 4 by David Dalglish. Chapter 1. Herne returned home to the Eschaton Tower exhausted. He'd scoured the area surrounding the murder as best he could and tracked down several runners of the Spider Guild. The few he found had heard nothing, seen nothing, and even when threatened, they showed no sign of lying. Leaving Veldaren for the tower beyond the city walls, he'd felt nothing but frustration and bafflement. He kept repeating the phrase in his head. Tongue of gold, eyes of silver. As he opened the door, the smell of cooked eggs welcomed him home. Delicia was the only one awake, and she sat beside the fireplace with a plate on her lap. The orange light shone across her red hair, making it seem all the more vibrant. Seeing him, she smiled. The smile faded from her youthful face when she noticed his sour mood. Something wrong? She asked. I'll talk about it later, he promised, heading for the stairs. Don't you want something to eat? He shook his head. He just wanted sleep. Hopefully, when he woke up, he'd have new ideas as to why someone had killed a member of the Spider Guild in such a ritualistic, not to mention expensive, manner. Besides, the thought of eating twisted his stomach. He'd seen a lot of horrible things, but for some reason he couldn't get the image out of his head of the corpse's vacant eye sockets replaced with coins. Eyes of silver. Herne climbed the stairs until he reached the 5th floor and his room. Hurrying inside, he sat down on his bed, removed his sword belt, and drew out his sabers. Carefully, he cleaned them with a cloth, refusing to go to bed with dirty swords no matter how tired he was. That was lazy and sloppy, and laziness and sloppiness had a way of sneaking out of one habit and into another. His many tutors had hammered that into his head while growing up, all so he could be a worthy heir to his father's empire of thieves and murderers. He chuckled, then put away his swords. Not quite according to plan, he thought, imagining Thren scowling. Not quite at all. Run. Run, little spider. His bed felt like the most wonderful thing in the world, and with a heavy cloth draped over his window, he closed his eyes amid blessed darkness. Sleep came quickly, despite his troubled mind. It did not, however, last very long. "Hey, Hern!" He opened an eye and saw his mercenary leader sitting beside him on the bed. His red beard and hair were unkempt from a night's sleep. He wore his wizard's robes, strangely dyed a yellow color for reasons he was sure he'd never hear. Trying not to smack the man, Hern rolled over. "Go away, Tarlac. Good morning to you too, Hern." Hern sighed. The wizard had something to say, and he wasn't going to leave until he said it. Rolling back, Hern shot him a tired glare. "What?" "Some fancy new noble is returning to the city today," Tarlac said, rubbing his fingernails against his robe and staring at them as if he were only mildly interested. "Lord Victor Kane? Perhaps you've heard of him?" The name was only vaguely familiar, which meant he'd been gone from Veldaren for a very long time. If he remembered correctly, he was just another one of those lords who lived outside the city and liked to occasionally make a scene proclaiming how horrible Veldaren was, and how much better it'd be if their ideas were listened to. All hot air, no substance. "Why should I care?" Hern asked, leaning against his pillow and closing his eyes. "Because he'll be meeting the king soon, perhaps within the hour. Normally this wouldn't be a big deal, but it sounds like he's bringing a veritable army with him." As if King Vela would let them pass through the gates. "That's the thing," Tarlac said. "It sounds like he will. He sent a message to the king. I won't bore you with all the details. Much of it was the standard pompous nonsense these lords are fond of, but one comment in particular was interesting enough my informant thought it worth waking me up early." Hern put his forearm across his eyes. "And what was that?" "I believe it was something to the extent of, 'Right now, thieves police thieves, yet when I am done, there will be no thieves at all.'" Tarlac stood from the bed, then walked over to the door. "Sounds like someone plans on taking your job." He left. The room once more returned to quiet darkness. Hern sat up, tossing the blankets aside. Damn it all. Chapter 2. Her servant woman fussed over her, fitting clothes, applying rouge, and brushing her hair until Elisa Gemcroft finally sent them away, unable to take any more. They filed out, leaving her alone in her extravagant bedroom. Well, not quite alone. "Come down, Zusa," she said. "Tell me what is wrong." From a far corner of the room, hidden in a dark space unlit by light from the windows, a woman fell to the ground. Despite the many years it had been since leaving Karak's cult of faceless women, Zusa still wore the tight wrappings across her body. Strips of cloth colored various shades of black and purple. Her head, at least, she kept exposed. Dark skin, dark hair cut short at the neck, and beautiful green eyes. A long gray cloak hung from her shoulders, the thin material curling about her body with the slightest tugs of Zusa's fingers. "There is nothing wrong," Zusa said, crossing her arms over her chest and leaning against the wall. "I'm used to you keeping an eye on me, but you only hide on the ceiling when you're nervous." She smiled at her friend. "You know I trust your instincts, so tell me." Zusa gestured to the dress. "You doll yourself up worse than a whore. Powder everywhere, rouge, perfume on your neck. And I must say, I pity your breasts." Elisa looked down at herself. She'd let her servants prepare her for her meeting, but had they gotten carried away? Her dress was a sultry red, tightly fitted, with a ring of rubies sewn along the neck. A gold chain held a large emerald tucked into the curve of her breasts, which, true to Zusa's words, her corset had rammed almost unnaturally high. "This is what is expected of me," Elisa said, sighing. She wanted to sit down but feared wrinkling her dress, or even worse, straining the ties of the corset. The realization made her blush, and she could tell Zusa knew her defense was a flimsy one. "Since when did Lady Gemcroft do the expected?" Zusa asked, the last of her nerves fading away with a smile. "But you are beautiful, even if overdone. I only wonder why. Lord Stephen is but a child, young even compared to you. Your smile alone should impress him." Elisa paced, keeping her movements slow and controlled, lest she muss her appearance.
It's been a year since his appointment, and I have yet to meet him. I fear he'll think I have snubbed him or deemed him unworthy of his position. I wish only to make a good impression." Zusa sat down on the bed, shifting the daggers tied to her waist so they did not poke into the soft mattress. "He will think it anyway," she said, "though I fear his impression will be that you are making advances on him." Elisa opened her mouth, closed it, and then looked to her dress. She sighed. "Help me, will you?" she asked. 10 minutes later she was in a far more comfortable dress, and they'd wiped clean her face. Elisa left her hair the same, having always enjoyed the sight of thin braids interlocked and weaved throughout her long red locks. Able to breathe and move far more freely, she hugged Zusa, then attached a simple lace of silver about her neck. "We have kept Stephen waiting long enough," she said. "Let's go." A litter waited outside her mansion, and she and Zusa climbed inside. As they traveled through the streets of Veldaren, Elisa felt butterflies in her stomach and did her best to belittle them. It was stupid to be nervous. Of the 3 families of the trifect, she'd been in power the longest and had clearly solidified her position as ruler of the Gemcroft fortune. Stephen Connington was but a bastard of his father, Leon. Still, he was the only one with a clear biological relation. It had taken several years before he'd been granted control of the estate from the caretakers. In the end, they'd had no choice. Leon had killed most of his family members and steadfastly refused to have named heirs, lest they drown him in his bath. She winced at the memory of Leon. He'd been unpleasant at times, if not repulsive. The fat had rolled off him, yet his tiny eyes had always been of a young, starving man eager to take, regardless the vice. She'd heard stories of what his gentle touchers, his private group of elite torturers, could do to a man to make him break. A shudder ran through her. She prayed that Stephen had inherited very little of his father beyond his name. As for the last family of the trifect, the Keenans, they'd yet to recover from the fiasco in Angelport 2 years before, when both Madeline and Laurie had been murdered along with their temporary successor, Torgar. Their grandchild, Tori, was the biological heir, but it would be many years before she could take over rule. That had left Stern Blackwater in charge of the Keenan fortune down in Angelport. There were benefits to this, a ceasing of significant conflict with the merchant lords of the south that had done their best to destroy them. Still, even Stern's rule was conflicted, and he rarely made any appearances beyond the walls of Angelport. If he thought the trifect was no longer in his granddaughter's interest, he'd cast them off in a heartbeat. That meant Elisa was the pillar of strength of the trifect, the one holding it all together. She had to be strong, confident. Zusa had been right. Terrible as it was, the last thing she wanted to do was flaunt her feminine qualities when she needed Stephen to take her seriously. "I should have brought Nathaniel with me," Elisa said as the litter bounced across the rough street. "Your son is better served with an honorable man like Lord Gandram than dealing with worms like the Conningtons," Zusa said. Elisa frowned and glanced out the curtained window to the passing homes. "Perhaps," she said, "but it won't be long before he must put away foolish fantasies of knights and armies. I won't have all I've built squandered and broken like it has for the Keenans. In time, he must learn to deal with the worms as well as the dragons." This has been an Hachette audio production of A Dance of Mirrors, written by David Dalglish, read by Elijah Alexander. Produced by Blackstone Audio, Inc. Production supervised by Christine M. Farrell. A Dance of Mirrors is also available in print and as an e-book from Orbit, a division of Hachette Book Group. Text copyright 2013 by David Dalglish. A Dance of Shadows excerpt text copyright 2013 by David Dalglish. Audio production copyright 2013, Hachette Audio, all rights reserved. In accordance with the U.S. Copyright Act of 1976, the duplicating, uploading, and electronic sharing of any part of this audiobook without the permission of the publisher is unlawful piracy and theft of the author's intellectual property.
If you would like to use material from the audiobook, other than for review purposes, prior written permission must be obtained by contacting the publisher at permissions@hbgusa.com. Thank you for your support of the author's rights. This audiobook is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or locales is entirely coincidental.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.